The coffee was still scalding hot when it hit my chest. It soaked instantly through the thin gray fabric of my uniform, burning my skin, but I refused to flinch. I just stood there, the wooden handle of my mop gripped tightly in my hands, while Julian Vance, the acting CEO of Vance Global, towered over me. His face was twisted in an ugly, arrogant sneer, his custom-tailored Italian suit practically vibrating with his manufactured rage. The sprawling marble-floored lobby of the Vance building went entirely silent. Dozens of employees in their sharp business attire froze, their eyes darting between the spilled latte pooling at my worn work shoes and the furious man who had just thrown it. "You are an invisible, worthless maid," Julian spat, his voice echoing off the vaulted glass ceiling. "You do not speak to me. You do not look at me. You clean up my messes and you disappear. That is what you are paid for." I could feel the eyes of the corporate world burning into me. They expected me to cry, to apologize, to shrink into the invisible speck of dirt Julian believed me to be. I was a 42-year-old African-American woman who spent her days and nights scrubbing the floors these people walked on. I knew exactly how they saw me. But as the hot coffee dripped down my uniform, my fingers grazed the deep pocket of my apron. Inside rested a crisp, heavily embossed legal document, a property deed, bearing my exact name. Julian had absolutely no idea that the lobby he was standing in, the expensive imported marble he was yelling about, and the very skyscraper he operated his entire corporate empire out of, secretly belonged to me. I did not lower my head. I did not apologize. Instead, a slow, steady smile spread across my face. But to understand how I ended up standing in the lobby of a 60-story skyscraper with a billionaire's coffee dripping down my chest and the deed to the building in my pocket, we have to go back. 4 months earlier, my biggest concern was not corporate warfare or secret real estate empires. It was trying to keep my marriage from drowning in a sea of passive-aggressive comments and unpaid utility bills. The alarm clock buzzed with its usual harsh metallic grating at 4:15 in the morning. I slammed my hand over the off button, wincing as the sudden jerky movement sent a dull, familiar ache shooting up my lower back. "Can you learn how to turn that thing off before it wakes the whole house?" Marcus groaned, rolling over and pulling the heavy down comforter completely over his shoulders. He did not open his eyes. He did not ask how I slept or if my back was hurting again. He just retreated back into the warmth, taking all the blankets with him and leaving me shivering in the dark. "Sorry," I whispered, sliding out of the freezing bed. The hardwood floor bit into my bare feet as I gathered my gray work scrubs from the back of the chair. Marcus and I had been married for 12 years. He was a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, a man who took extreme pride in his public appearance. His suits were always perfectly pressed, his beard lined up with geometric precision, his dress shoes meticulously shined. I used to look at him with such intense admiration. Lately, though, looking at Marcus just felt like staring at a blank brick wall. The warmth had completely drained out of our home over the last few years, replaced by a cold, transactional silence that left me feeling entirely alone even when we were in the same room. I tiptoed down the hall of our modest 3-bedroom house in the Atlanta suburbs, trying to avoid the floorboards I knew would creak. I had worked 2 jobs for the first 5 years of our marriage just to secure the down payment for this place. I loved this house. I love the wraparound porch we painted every spring and the massive old oak tree in the front yard. But recently, it felt significantly less like a sanctuary and much more like a battleground. And the primary combatant was already awake. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a steaming cup of black coffee in the pre-dawn gloom. She was a formidable woman in her late 60s, her hair smoothed back into an immaculate, severely tight silver bun. She moved in with us 2 years ago when her husband passed, under the pretense that she needed familial support to cope with her grief. In reality, she just needed a captive audience for her constant, daily disapproval. "Morning, Evelyn," I said, keeping my voice light and pleasant as I headed straight for the coffee pot. "You are wearing that again?" she asked, her eyes raking over my faded gray uniform with clear disdain. "They do not give you a fresh set, Maya. It smells like industrial bleach and cheap floor wax." "I washed it last night," I replied, grabbing a travel mug from the metal drying rack. "And it is a cleaning uniform, Evelyn. It is supposed to smell clean." Evelyn let out a soft, dismissive sigh, the kind that was expertly designed to sound sophisticated but cut like a jagged kitchen knife. "I just do not understand why you insist on doing this kind of manual labor at your age. Marcus has a highly respectable position at his firm. It is downright embarrassing for him to have to tell his professional colleagues that his wife scrubs public toilets for a living." I gripped the edge of the cold granite counter, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I immediately tasted copper. I desperately wanted to tell her that my manual labor was currently paying the property taxes she lived under, primarily because her precious, respectable son had quietly blown his last 2 holiday bonuses on extravagant golf trips and luxury car leases he could not afford. I wanted to scream that honest, hard work was nothing to be ashamed of and that my paychecks kept the lights on. But I valued morning peace over being right. "It is honest work," I said evenly, pouring my coffee and refusing to make eye contact. "And it consistently pays the bills." "Marcus could have married a lawyer," she murmured to her coffee cup, pitching her voice just loud enough for me to catch every agonizing syllable. "He dated that lovely girl, Vanessa, right before you. She is a senior partner at a massive corporate firm downtown now. I saw her beautiful new house online just yesterday." The familiar heavy sting of inadequacy flared deep in the center of my chest, but I ruthlessly forced it down. I grabbed my car keys and my worn canvas tote bag, desperate to escape the suffocating, toxic air of my own kitchen. "Have a good day, Evelyn," I said, hurrying out the front door before she could offer another unsolicited critique of my life choices. The drive into the city was a lonely blur of glowing red brake lights and heavy, damp morning fog. When I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into the underground employee parking garage beneath Sterling Towers, the sheer scale of the building still managed to take my breath away. 60 floors of gleaming mirrored glass and reinforced steel piercing the gray Atlanta sky. I loved this building. Over the past 15 years, I had learned every quirk of its temperamental freight elevators and memorized every hidden corner of its sprawling, polished lobbies. I swiped my faded security badge and headed down the stark concrete hallway to the basement locker room. It was quiet, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing a low hum overhead. I was the day shift cleaning supervisor, which meant I arrived hours before the sun came up to ensure the executive floors were absolutely pristine before the corporate suits arrived for their morning meetings. As I twisted the combination dial on my battered metal locker, my mind drifted unbidden to Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the original owner and mastermind behind this massive skyscraper. He was a legendary real estate mogul, a billionaire many times over, but to me, he was just a quiet, incredibly observant old man who used to arrive early and stay late in his penthouse office. For the last 10 years, I was the one specifically assigned to clean his private suite. We used to share quiet conversations over terrible break room coffee while the rest of the city slept. He treated me like a human being, asking about my day, listening to my thoughts on the world, when everyone else in the building treated me like a moving piece of furniture. He knew about my financial struggles, and he knew about my quiet dream of one day owning my own commercial cleaning business instead of just working for one. But Arthur had passed away 2 weeks ago from a sudden, massive heart attack. The entire building had been in a state of chaotic mourning and corporate panic, But my grief was deeply personal and entirely silent. I had lost the only person in this sprawling corporate machine who actually saw me. My best friend and coworker, Sarah, walked into the locker room, tying her dark hair back into a tight, practical ponytail. She took one look at my face and let out a heavy sigh, dropping her bag onto a nearby bench. "Marcus again?" Sarah asked knowingly, leaning against the lockers and crossing her arms. Sarah was the only person in the entire world who knew exactly how bad things were actually getting at home. Evelyn, mostly. And Marcus, I admitted, pulling my heavy, tool-laden supply belt from my locker and strapping it around my waist. "I do not know, Sarah. I just feel like I am breaking my back every single day for people who do not even see me. I am just a maid to Evelyn. And to Marcus, I do not even know what I am to him anymore. Sometimes I think I am just the woman who deposits checks into the joint account to pay the mortgage." Sarah reached out and squeezed my shoulder, her eyes full of fierce empathy. "You are the hardest working woman I know, Maya. Do not let those miserable people make you feel small in your own house. You are worth 10 of them." I gave her a weak, grateful smile, thankful for her unwavering presence. We grabbed our heavy-wheeled supply carts and took the slow, rattling freight elevator up to the executive floors. The atmosphere on the 40th floor was palpably tense and suffocating. Since Arthur Sterling's unexpected passing, his nephew, Julian Vance, had forcefully taken the reins as acting CEO. Julian was everything his late uncle was not. He was loud, deeply entitled, notoriously cruel, and utterly dismissive of anyone operating below his tax bracket. The transition had been brutal on the support staff, with Julian already firing 3 people for minor, perceived infractions. I parked my cart near the main boardroom and began polishing the heavy brass door fixtures. The repetitive physical motion usually calmed my nerves, giving me time to think and breathe. I reached into my apron pocket to pull out my phone, intending to check if Marcus had texted me a morning apology. He had not. Instead, there was a single unread email notification on my screen. I swiped the screen to clear it, but the sender's name caught my eye and made my thumb freeze in midair. It was from an address I did not recognize, but the domain name was unmistakable. Sterling and Associates Legal. My brow furrowed in genuine, deep confusion. Why on earth would Arthur Sterling's high-powered, exclusive estate legal team be contacting a nighttime cleaning supervisor? I tapped the notification, my heart suddenly doing a strange, frantic rhythm against my ribs. The subject line read, "Urgent and highly confidential regarding the estate of Arthur Sterling." I glanced rapidly down the empty, carpeted hallway to ensure no supervisors or executives were watching me idle on company time. My hands were actually trembling as I opened the message. The text was brief, formal, and terrifyingly clear. "Dear Mrs. Maya Caldwell, this office represents the estate of the late Arthur Sterling. It is of the utmost importance that we meet in person today. This matter concerns a highly confidential, irrevocable directive left by Mr. Sterling prior to his passing. You are legally instructed to come to the private legal suite on the 60th floor at precisely 2 o'clock this afternoon. Please inform no one of this communication, not your direct supervisors, and absolutely not your family. Your absolute discretion is required." I stared blindly at the glowing screen, the harsh black words blurring together. The 60th floor, the private legal suite. The highest, most powerful executives in the company rarely went up there, let alone the cleaning staff. My mind raced through a dozen terrifying, rapid-fire scenarios. Had I done something terribly wrong? Was I being fired for something I broke in his office? Did Arthur leave me a small financial token of appreciation? Or was this some kind of cruel, elaborate corporate mistake? Before I could even begin to process the reality of the words staring back at me, the heavy oak double doors of the boardroom violently swung open behind me. Julian Vance stormed out, barking aggressively into his cell phone, surrounded by a flock of nervous, furiously nodding executives. He was not looking where his expensive leather shoes were going. He walked directly toward my supply cart, his foot stomping deliberately onto the freshly mopped floor I had just cleaned. I quickly shoved my phone deep into my apron pocket, my pulse hammering a frantic beat in my ears. The secret email burned like a physical brand against my hip. I lowered my head, gripping my mop tightly with sweating hands, suddenly and painfully aware that whatever was waiting for me on the 60th floor was about to violently collide with the life I knew. The silence in the penthouse office was so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I stared at my cracked phone screen, at the manicured fingers intertwined with my husband's hand, until the image blurred. Two realities violently collided in my chest. On the polished mahogany desk sat a stack of legal papers declaring me the sole owner of Sterling Towers. In my hand, digital proof that the man I had scrubbed toilets to support was giving his heart to someone else. "Are you all right, Maya?" Richard Gable's voice pulled me back from the edge of the abyss. The attorney was watching me with a mixture of professional concern and deep empathy. I locked my phone and slid it back into my faded apron pocket, my fingers brushing against the rough cotton. "I am fine," I lied, my voice steadying with a cold, unfamiliar resolve. It felt as though a steel rod had just been fused directly into my spine. "Mr. Gable, if I own this building, why is Julian Vance downstairs acting like he rules the world? Why cannot I just go down there and fire him right now?" Richard sighed, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. "Because Arthur knew Julian would fight this tooth and nail. Julian has access to massive corporate funds and a team of vicious litigators. The transfer of the primary holding company to you is ironclad, but it must pass through a mandatory 30-day probate clearance to be legally untouchable. If Julian discovers that Arthur bypassed him for the nighttime cleaning supervisor before the ink is dry on the final court orders, he will file endless injunctions. He will freeze the building's operating accounts. He will destroy the legacy before you even take the reins." I looked down at my hands. They were calloused, my knuckles dry and cracked from industrial bleach. "You are telling me I have to go back down there. I have to keep being his maid." "You must be a ghost, Maya," Richard said, his tone urgent. "You must be exactly what Julian Vance thinks you are, invisible. Give him no reason to look your way. In exactly 30 days, we execute the final documents. Until then, you endure." I nodded slowly. Enduring was what I did best. I had spent 12 years enduring a crumbling marriage and a lifetime enduring the world's low expectations. 30 days was nothing. I signed the preliminary non-disclosure agreements, folded a discreet copy of the holding company transfer into the deepest pocket of my uniform, and unlocked the heavy oak door. The ride down in the freight elevator felt like descending into a completely different dimension. The polished mirrors reflected a middle-aged woman in a stained gray uniform, but beneath the cheap fabric, my heart beat with the steady rhythm of an empire. When the heavy metal doors rattled open on the 40th floor, the chaotic reality of my everyday life crashed back over me. My best friend Sarah was hurriedly swapping out trash bags on her supply cart, her face flushed with stress. "Where have you been?" she whispered frantically, glancing over her shoulder. "Julian is on a rampage. He just fired one of the daytime receptionists because her heels clicked too loudly on the marble." Before I could invent an excuse, the sharp, aggressive sound of Julian's voice echoed down the corridor. He rounded the corner like a storm front, trailed by his usual sycophants. His eyes locked onto Sarah and me, narrowing with instant disgust. "You there!" Julian barked, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "The East Wing conference rooms smell like cheap pine sol. It is revolting. I have international investors arriving in 2 hours. I want the carpets shampooed, the glass polished, and every surface wiped down with odorless cleaner. Mr. Vance, I kept my voice perfectly level, dropping my gaze to his expensive shoes exactly as a subordinate should. That wing takes a full crew 4 hours to deep clean. We only have 2 people on this floor right now. Julian stepped into my personal space, his cologne cloying and aggressive. I did not ask for a scheduling report, he sneered, his face inches from mine. I gave you an order. If you cannot handle basic sanitation, I will fire this entire crew today and replace you with contractors who actually want to work. You are completely replaceable trash. Do you understand me? Sarah shrank back against her cart, her eyes wide with panic. She was a single mother. Losing this job would ruin her. I felt the crisp edge of the legal deed pressing against my thigh. I could destroy him. I could ruin his life with a single phone call to Richard Gable. But the 30-day rule echoed in my mind. I had to protect my team, and I had to protect my empire. We will get it done immediately, Mr. Vance, I said, swallowing the bitter taste of submission. I am sorry for the inconvenience. See that you do, he scoffed, turning on his heel. And make yourself scarce before my guests arrive. I do not want them looking at you. For the next 2 hours, Sarah and I worked until our muscles screamed, hauling heavy shampooing equipment and scrubbing endless panels of glass. I absorbed Sarah's anxious chatter, offering quiet reassurances, while my mind meticulously catalogued every square inch of the floor. This was my carpet. This was my glass. I was not cleaning for Julian anymore. I was maintaining my own investment. By the time my shift ended, my lower back was throbbing with a familiar, relentless ache. I drove home through the sluggish Atlanta traffic, the exhaustion seeping into my bones. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, save for the flickering blue light of the television illuminating the living room window. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted immediately by the stifling atmosphere of my domestic life. Marcus was sprawled on the expensive leather sofa, wearing a crisp, casual button-down shirt. He did not look like a man who had been working late. He looked fresh, relaxed, and he smelled faintly of an unfamiliar, expensive floral perfume. The image of the intertwined hands on his steering wheel flashed hot and bright in my mind. "Long day?" I asked, slipping off my worn work shoes. "Exhausting," Marcus sighed smoothly, not bothering to look away from the television screen. "The new client is incredibly demanding. I had to take them to that new steakhouse downtown just to keep the account secure. I am completely drained, Maya." He lied with such effortless grace that it actually made me physically nauseous. I nodded, playing the part of the tired, naive wife. "I am going to shower," I murmured. As I passed the kitchen, Evelyn emerged from the pantry, clutching a glass of iced tea. She looked me up and down, her lips pursuing in standard disapproval. "Marcus works so hard to provide for this family," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The least you could do is have a hot meal ready for him when he gets home. A real wife would anticipate her husband's needs instead of dragging in here smelling like industrial chemicals." I stopped in the hallway, the exhaustion suddenly threatening to pull me under. "Evelyn, I have been on my feet for 12 hours. Marcus is perfectly capable of using the microwave." She let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "You just lack ambition, Maya, always have. Marcus is up for a regional director position next month. He is moving up in the world, associating with high-value people. You really need to think about how your lack of refinement reflects on him. It is holding him back." I stared at her, marveling at the absolute delusion of the woman. She was lecturing a billionaire about lacking ambition while her son was funneling his middle management salary toward a mistress. "You are absolutely right, Evelyn," I said softly, a genuine, chilling smile touching my lips. "I have a lot of changes to make." I left her standing there, looking slightly unnerved by my lack of argument. I retreated to the small spare bedroom we used as a home office and firmly locked the door behind me. The house was suffocating, a monument to a life I no longer belonged to. But I was a practical woman. Before I could blow up my marriage, before I could evict my terrible mother-in-law, I had to secure my logistics. The mortgage was due tomorrow, and despite my newfound secret wealth, the holding company accounts were legally frozen for the next month. I still had to survive the present. I sat down at the small oak desk and opened my battered laptop. The screen cast a harsh, pale light across my tired face. I needed to pay the mortgage and the utility bills to keep up appearances. I navigated to our joint banking portal, the account where I religiously deposited every single paycheck from both my cleaning jobs. Marcus managed the outbound payments, but we had always maintained enough of a buffer to keep us comfortable. I typed in my password and hit enter. The loading wheel spun for a few agonizing seconds. I reached up, rubbing the tension from my temples, calculating how many hours of overtime I could pick up next week to cover the groceries. The dashboard finally loaded. I blinked, my eyes refusing to comprehend the numbers displayed in bold black text on the screen. I refreshed the page. I refreshed it again. The numbers did not change. Available balance, $0. My breath caught in my throat. I frantically clicked into the transaction history, my hands shaking violently. 3 days ago, a massive outbound wire transfer had been initiated. $58,000. Every single penny of our savings. The money I had scrubbed toilets, polished glass, and broken my back to accumulate over 12 grueling years. It had all been completely drained and transferred to an external offshore LLC. I sat alone in the dark office, the pale light of the laptop illuminating the absolute devastation of my personal finances. Marcus had not just found another woman. He had systematically stolen my entire life. I slammed my laptop shut, the sharp crack echoing in the cramped, dimly lit home office. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press them flat against my thighs just to force myself to stand up. $58,000. Gone. Every single shift, every missed holiday, every ache in my spine over the last 12 years had just been wiped out with a few keystrokes. I marched down the narrow hallway, my vision tunneling. Marcus was still sprawled out on the living room sofa, the television blaring some late-night sports commentary. He looked completely relaxed, his feet propped up on the mahogany coffee table I had bought for his birthday 3 years ago. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register, "where is our money?" He did not even flinch. He casually muted the television, picking up his glass of bourbon, and looked up at me with an expression of mild, practiced annoyance. "What are you talking about, Maya? I am trying to unwind." "The joint account," I said, stepping directly into his line of sight so he could not look away. "I logged in to pay the mortgage. The balance is 0. There was a massive wire transfer 3 days ago to an offshore LLC. Where is it?" Marcus let out a long, patronizing sigh. He set his glass down and sat up, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from his pristine slacks. "Maya, please calm down. You are being completely dramatic. It is a high-yield, short-term investment. A senior guy at the firm tipped me off about a massive commercial real estate flip. The returns are going to be astronomical. I am securing our financial future." "Without telling me?" I demanded, the sheer audacity of his smooth lie making my chest physically ache. I knew about the text message on my phone. I knew about the photo of the intertwined hands on his steering wheel. I knew about the unfamiliar perfume clinging to his collar. But I could not reveal my hand yet. Not when I had 0 cash to survive the month and a 30-day legal waiting period hanging over my head. "You emptied my entire life savings for a supposed real estate flip?" "It is our savings," he corrected smoothly, standing up to tower over me. "And frankly, I did not tell you because I knew you would react exactly like this. You do not understand high-level finance, Maya. You scrub floors. You panic over every single penny. I needed to move fast before the market closed. Before I could respond, the heavy thud of Evelyn's orthopedic slippers sounded behind me. She stepped into the living room, wrapping a floral silk robe tightly around her waist, her face pulled into a tight scowl. "Is there a reason you are shrieking like a banshee at midnight, Maya?" Evelyn asked, her eyes darting between us. "Marcus emptied our bank account," I said, refusing to take my eyes off my husband. Evelyn scoffed, waving her manicured hand in the air as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Oh, for heaven's sake! Marcus is an educated professional. He handles the finances because he actually understands them. If he made an investment, it is because he is trying to elevate this family out of the blue-collar gutter you seem so comfortable living in." "He took $58,000, Evelyn!" I yelled, my composure finally fracturing under the weight of their unified gaslighting. "And he will double it!" Evelyn snapped back, stepping protectively next to her son. "Stop suffocating him with your working-class anxiety. You lack the basic financial literacy to understand how real wealth is built. Let the man work." Marcus offered me a sad, condescending smile. "See? Mom gets it. Just trust me, Maya. I have it all completely under control." They walked into the kitchen together, murmuring about my lack of vision, leaving me standing alone in the living room. My stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot. I could not touch the sterling holding company funds for 29 more days. I had exactly $0 to my name, a mortgage due tomorrow, and a husband actively trying to bankrupt me. The next morning, the exhaustion was a physical weight crushing my shoulders. I rode the rattling freight elevator up to the 40th floor of Sterling Towers, my gray uniform feeling more like a prison jumpsuit than ever. I needed cash, immediately. I found Sarah in the primary supply closet, violently shaking a jammed spray bottle of disinfectant. "I need a massive favor," I whispered, pulling her into the quiet service corridor. "I need to ask facility management for an emergency overtime advance. Can you cover my section of the glass atrium for 20 minutes? Sarah's eyes widened with immediate, genuine concern. "Maya, are you crazy? Julian just fired the overnight security guard for asking to switch shifts to take his kid to the doctor. Management is terrified of him right now. They aren't approving a single dime of extra payroll." "I do not have a choice, Sarah," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I literally cannot pay my mortgage today. I just need an advance on next week's hours." I squeezed her hand and marched toward the main executive corridor. Facility management was located just past the grand boardroom. I kept my head down, moving quickly, but as I rounded the corner, I froze. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom were propped wide open. Inside, Julian Vance was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by a dozen silent, terrified executives. He was holding a sleek tablet, gesturing wildly as he outlined his ruthless quarterly budget cuts. I tried to slip past the open doors, pressing my back against the corridor wall, but the squeak of my rubber-soled work shoes betrayed me on the polished marble. Julian's head snapped toward the hallway. "You!" he barked. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart lodging itself firmly in my throat. I turned around slowly, my hands clasped tightly in front of my apron. "Get in here," Julian ordered, crooking his finger. I stepped into the boardroom. The air conditioning was frigid, the silence absolute. 12 high-powered executives stared at me as if I had just crawled out of a sewer drain. "Since you are interrupting my executive briefing," Julian sneered, pacing toward me like a predator sizing up a very weak meal, "perhaps you have something to contribute. What are you doing out of the service corridors during daylight hours?" "I was on my way to facility management, Mr. Vance," I said, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on his expensive silk tie to avoid his glaring eyes. "I wanted to request an emergency overtime advance for the weekend shifts." Julian stopped pacing. He looked at me, then looked around the massive table at his executives. A slow, incredibly cruel smile stretched across his face. "An overtime advance," Julian repeated, the words dripping with manufactured amusement. "Did you all hear that? The cleaning lady wants an advance." A few of the executives forced out nervous, sycophantic chuckles. "Mr. Vance, I have been here for 15 years, I said, pushing down the rising bile in my throat. "I have never asked for an advance. I am facing an unexpected financial emergency at home, and I am simply asking to work extra hours to cover it." Julian slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. The loud crack made two executives visibly flinch in their high-backed leather chairs. "I do not care about your pathetic domestic issues," Julian roared, his face suddenly turning a mottled, furious red. "I am in the middle of restructuring a billion-dollar empire, and you have the audacity to walk into my boardroom and beg for pennies?" I stood frozen, my fingernails digging so hard into my palms they drew blood. Inside my pocket, the crisp fold of the property deed felt like a burning coal. I owned the chair he was leaning on. I owned the table he had just hit. I owned the very air he was breathing. All I had to do was pull that paper out and destroy him. "You must be a ghost, Maya." Richard Gable's warning echoed in my mind. If he finds out before the 30 days are up, he will freeze the accounts and destroy the legacy. I forced my hands to relax. I swallowed my pride, letting it burn all the way down. "I apologize, Mr. Vance," I said softly. "I will return to my shift." "No, you will listen to me," Julian snapped, taking another aggressive step forward until he was entirely in my personal space. "This entire cleaning staff is a bloated, expensive liability. You are all lazy and entirely replaceable. If you ever speak to me again, or if you ever beg my management team for unearned handouts, I will fire every single janitor in this building by 5 o'clock. I will replace your entire department with third-party minimum wage contractors before the sun sets. Do you understand me, you invisible piece of trash?" He was holding my entire crew hostage, Sarah's job, my team's livelihood. "I understand, sir," I whispered. "Get out of my sight," Julian sneered, turning his back on me. I walked out of the boardroom, my face burning with a humiliation so profound it made my ears ring. I had survived the confrontation, but the cost to my dignity was staggering. I spent the rest of my shift scrubbing toilets, crying silent, angry tears into the harsh chemical fumes. When I finally dragged myself home that evening, the house was completely silent. Evelyn's car was gone. She had likely gone to her weekly bridge club to complain about me to her wealthy friends. Marcus's luxury sedan was in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be seen on the main floor. I walked into the laundry room, my muscles aching with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. A pile of Marcus's clothes sat discarded on the floor next to the washing machine. I knelt down, mechanically grabbing his slacks to sort them before starting a load. As I pulled a pair of his expensive, custom-tailored gray trousers from the pile, something crinkled sharply in the front pocket. My hands froze. I reached into the silk-lined pocket, my fingers brushing against a stiff piece of paper and a smooth, hard plastic card. I pulled them out into the harsh fluorescent light of the laundry room. The first item was a sleek black hotel key card. The logo embossed on the front belonged to the St. Regis, one of the most exclusive, wildly expensive luxury hotels in downtown Atlanta. The second item was a crumpled, thermal-printed receipt from a high-end jeweler in Buckhead. I flattened the paper against the cool metal top of the washing machine, my eyes desperately scanning the faded ink. Diamond tennis necklace, 18-karat white gold, total $14,500. Payment method, cash/wire transfer. Date, 3 days ago. The exact day $58,000 vanished from our joint account. Marcus had not just stolen my life savings for a fake real estate flip. He was actively using the money I broke my back earning to fund a luxurious, secret life with his mistress. I stared at the receipt, my breathing turning shallow and fast. He was systematically draining my resources to buy diamonds for another woman, leaving me completely destitute in the process. Suddenly, the heavy thud of footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor behind me. "Maya?" Marcus's voice echoed from the hallway, sharp and immediately suspicious. "What are you doing in my pockets?" I froze, the crumpled thermal paper feeling suddenly like a live wire burning against my palm. The harsh fluorescent light of the laundry room flickered, casting long, sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. I slowly turned to face my husband, the man I had spent over a decade loving, supporting, and funding. Marcus stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowed into dark, calculating slits. He did not look like a man who had just been caught betraying his wife. He looked like a predator whose territory had been breached. "I asked you a question, Maya," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, even register. He stepped into the small room, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of laundry detergent in a way that made my stomach violently churn. "Why are you digging through my personal property?" I held up the receipt, my hand trembling so badly the paper rustled in the quiet room. Beside it, pinched between my thumb and index finger, was the sleek black keycard for the St. Regis. "Your personal property?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, choked by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. "You told me you emptied our joint account, $58,000, Marcus, for a high-yield commercial real estate investment. Yet here is a receipt for a $14,500 diamond tennis necklace purchased on the exact same day our life savings vanished. Did the necklace come with the real estate?" Marcus did not flinch. He did not drop his gaze or stammer out an apology. Instead, he let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as if I were a toddler who had just asked a fundamentally stupid question. He reached out and snatched the receipt and the keycard from my trembling fingers with lightning speed. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Marcus demanded, his voice thick with patronizing disgust. "Do you honestly hear yourself right now? You are acting completely unhinged." "I am unhinged," I countered, my voice rising. "You stole my money." "It is a corporate expense, Maya," he shouted, stepping so close I was forced to lean back against the cold metal of the washing machine. The senior partners tasked me with purchasing a retirement gift for the CEO's wife. I floated the cash temporarily to secure the piece before the jeweler closed, and the firm is reimbursing me on Monday. And the key card? We booked a daytime executive suite to prep for the regional conference away from the office distractions. But of course, your mind immediately goes to the gutter. He stared down at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any affection. "You are exhausted, Maya. You work ridiculous, draining hours, scrubbing floors, and it is rotting your brain. You are projecting your own miserable, stagnant paranoia onto a man who is actually trying to build a future." Before I could even process the breathtaking audacity of his lie, the heavy, shuffling footsteps of Evelyn sounded in the hallway. She appeared behind Marcus, her face pulled into a tight, severe scowl, clutching her silk robe at the collar. "What on earth is this screeching?" Evelyn demanded, glaring at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into her immaculate home. Marcus turned to his mother, letting out a long, long-suffering sigh. "Maya is snooping through my clothes, Mom. She found a corporate gift receipt and a meeting room key and is accusing me of God knows what. She is completely losing her grip on reality." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into slits of pure disdain. She stepped up beside her son, forming a unified, impenetrable wall of hostility. "I warned you about this, Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I told you that her kind of manual labor breaks down the mind. She breathes in industrial bleach all night, and it makes her delusional. She has no understanding of how the corporate world operates, no financial literacy, and zero class." "I know what I saw," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and profound isolation. He drained our account. He is managing the family wealth because you are entirely incapable of doing so, Evelyn snapped, stepping toward me. You are a paranoid, deeply insecure woman trying to drag a successful man down to your level. If you continue to behave like a hysterical, jealous shrew, you are going to drive him away. And frankly, I would not blame him. I stood trapped against the washing machine, completely surrounded by their psychological warfare. The gaslighting was so intense, so seamlessly executed, that for a fraction of a second, the room spun. They were attempting to rewrite my reality, banking on the fact that I was too tired, too beaten down by the world to fight back. I felt the crisp edge of the property deed resting in my apron pocket in the hallway. I could end them both. I could kick them out onto the street tonight. But Richard Gable's warning echoed loudly in my mind. You must be a ghost. 30 days. If I blew up my domestic life now, Julian Vance's lawyers would descend on the chaos, uncovering my identity before the probate cleared. I had to endure. I lowered my head, staring at the linoleum floor, and forced the words past the agonizing lump in my throat. I am sorry, I whispered, the lie tasting like ash. I am just tired. Marcus scoffed, turning on his heel. Unbelievable, he muttered, walking away. Evelyn gave me one last look of utter disgust before following him, leaving me completely alone in the cold, damp laundry room. The next morning, the drive to Sterling Towers was a blur of gray fog and silent tears. I felt entirely hollowed out, a ghost haunting my own life. I swiped my faded badge and descended into the basement locker room, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights amplifying the pounding headache throbbing behind my eyes. Sarah was already there, strapping on her heavy supply belt. She took one look at my pale, drawn face and immediately pulled me into a tight hug. I didn't cry, but I held on to her like a lifeline. She was the only genuine thing left in my world. We just have to get through today, Sarah whispered, handing me my cart keys. Keep your head down. Julian has been pacing the lobby since 6 a.m. He is looking for blood. We took the freight elevator up to the grand lobby. The space was a breathtaking expanse of imported Italian marble, towering glass walls, and sleek steel fixtures. It was a masterpiece of architecture, and it secretly belonged to me. But as I pushed my rattling supply cart out into the open, I felt less like an owner and more like a prisoner. Julian Vance was standing near the central reception desk, surrounded by a nervous flock of junior executives. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, his posture rigid with manufactured authority. His eyes darted around the lobby, seeking any minor imperfection he could weaponize. Sarah was assigned to polish the massive glass entryway doors. She moved quickly, her cloth working in tight, efficient circles. I was sweeping the perimeter, keeping my head down, doing exactly what I was paid to do. Be invisible. Suddenly, a businessman in a rush barged through the front doors, his heavy leather briefcase swinging wildly. He collided hard with Sarah's shoulder. The impact sent her stumbling backward. The bottle of blue glass cleaner slipped from her hands, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack and shattering into a dozen pieces. Bright blue liquid splattered across the pristine white stone. The lobby went dead silent. Julian Vance's head snapped toward the sound. He locked onto Sarah, his eyes lighting up with sadistic glee. He marched across the lobby, his leather shoes echoing like gunshots in the quiet expanse. "What is this?" Julian demanded, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. Sarah was already on her knees, frantically gathering the shards of plastic and wiping at the blue liquid with a microfiber cloth. "I am so sorry, Mr. Vance," she stammered, her hands shaking visibly. "A gentleman bumped into me. I will have it spotless in 10 seconds. "Stand up," Julian barked. Sarah froze, then slowly stood, clutching the wet, blue-stained cloth to her chest. She looked terrified. "You are incompetent," Julian said, his voice dripping with venom. He looked around the lobby, ensuring he had an audience. "This building is a symbol of global excellence, and you are treating it like a truck stop. I will not tolerate clumsy, pathetic trash ruining my aesthetic." "Please, sir," Sarah begged, tears welling in her eyes. "I am a single mother. I need this job. It was an accident." "It is a liability," Julian sneered. "You are fired. Pack up your locker and be out of my building in 5 minutes, or I will have security throw you out." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I stepped forward, abandoning my broom. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It was not her fault. The guest pushed her. Please, she is our best worker." Julian slowly turned his head to look at me, his lip curling into a snarl. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he asked, stepping toward me. "I warned you yesterday about speaking to me. You are nothing. You are dirt. If you utter one more syllable to defend this incompetent woman, I will fire you, and I will fire every single cleaner on this shift immediately. Do you want to be responsible for putting 50 people on the street today?" I froze. I looked at Sarah. Her face was pale, tears spilling over her cheeks, but she gave me a microscopic, desperate shake of her head. "Don't do it, Maya. Don't lose your job, too." The powerlessness was suffocating. I owned the floor Julian was standing on, but the 30-day probate rule shackled me completely. If I revealed myself, he would freeze the accounts, trap the building in endless litigation, and Sarah would still be fired, along with everyone else. I had to watch my best friend be publicly humiliated and stripped of her livelihood, and I could not do a single thing to stop it. I stepped back, biting my lips so hard I tasted copper. I lowered my head. "That is what I thought," Julian scoffed. He gestured to 2 massive security guards. "Escort her to the basement, then out the back door." I watched Sarah being marched away like a criminal, my chest heaving with silent, agonizing breaths. I was completely, utterly alone. I was trapped in a home with a husband stealing my life, and trapped in a building I owned, forced to bow to a tyrant. When my shift finally ended, the drive home felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating nightmare. The house was quiet when I walked in, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. I walked up the stairs to the master bedroom. Marcus was standing at the foot of the bed, aggressively zipping up a sleek leather weekend duffel bag. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, looking effortlessly polished and entirely unbothered by the events of the previous night. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of any remaining warmth. Marcus didn't even look at me. "I have a regional directors conference in Miami," he said smoothly, slinging the heavy bag over his shoulder. "It is an emergency summit. I will be gone until Monday night." "A conference," I repeated, the lie transparent and insulting. Miami. A luxury trip funded by the $58,000 he had stolen from me. "Yes, Maya, a conference," he snapped, walking past me toward the door. "Try not to invent any paranoid delusions while I'm gone. Mom will be here if you need anything, though I highly suggest you just keep to yourself." He walked down the stairs and out the front door without another word. The heavy thud of the door closing echoed through the empty house. I stood in the bedroom, the silence pressing down on me, heavy and absolute. The walls of my life were closing in, crushing the last remnants of my endurance. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently in my apron pocket. I pulled it out, the screen lighting up the dim room. It was a highly encrypted, priority-flagged email from Richard Gable's private legal server. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second before tapping the notification. The subject line was written in stark, aggressive capitalization. "Urgent. Immediate action required to prevent total asset liquidation." I scanned the brief, terrifying text. "Maya. Julian Vance has illegally bypassed the standard holding protocols. He has initiated a hostile transfer to liquidate the primary operational accounts to an offshore shell company. Probate protections will not stop this maneuver in time. If those accounts are drained, the building will default, and your ownership will be legally voided. The 30-day wait is no longer an option. If you do not appear at the 60th floor legal suite by 5 p.m. today to execute the emergency override, Arthur Sterling's entire legacy and your empire will be permanently erased. I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. It was 4:15 p.m. I had exactly 45 minutes to declare war. The glowing screen of my phone felt like a physical brand burning into my retinas. 4:15 p.m. I had exactly 45 minutes to stop Julian Vance from liquidating the Sterling legacy and erasing my only hope of survival. I was already spinning toward the bedroom door, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs when my phone vibrated a second time in my palm. I froze, my thumb hovering over the glass. It was another encrypted message from Richard Gable. Update. Julian's offshore wire transfer just bounced due to an international routing error on their end. The banking window has closed for the weekend. We have exactly 48 hours until they can reinitiate the liquidation on Monday morning. Do not break your cover today. Maintain your shifts. We strike when the probate clears. The adrenaline crashed out of my system so fast that my knees physically buckled. I sank onto the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands, trying to force oxygen into my burning lungs. 48 hours. The delay was a microscopic, miraculous mercy, but it meant I still had to be a ghost. I had to swallow the bile in my throat, put on my gray uniform, and go back to scrubbing the very floors that were currently at the center of a billion-dollar corporate war. To maintain the illusion of my pathetic, invisible existence, and to keep a watchful eye on Julian's executive floor, I picked up a grueling overnight double shift. For 16 agonizing hours, I emptied trash cans, polished glass, and scrubbed the heavy marble tiles of Sterling Towers. Every ache in my spine, every burn in my knuckles felt like a cruel joke. I was a billionaire heiress wiping up spilled coffee in the employee break room. I moved through the silent, dimly lit corridors like a phantom, my mind spinning endlessly between Julian's ruthless cruelty and the $14,500 diamond necklace receipt sitting in my apron pocket. It was past 9 in the morning when I finally dragged myself back to my neighborhood. The sky was the color of bruised iron, a bitter, biting cold settling over the quiet suburban street. My beat-up sedan rattled as I pulled into my driveway. My entire body felt heavy, weighed down by a bone-deep exhaustion that transcended physical fatigue. All I wanted was a hot shower in my bed. I grabbed my bag, trudged up the front porch steps, and slid my key into the lock of my front door. It did not turn. I frowned, my numb fingers jiggling the key, trying to force it. It hit a solid, immovable block. I pulled the key out and looked closely at the door. The familiar scratched silver deadbolt was gone. In its place was a shiny, pristine brass fixture. My breath caught in my throat, forming a white cloud in the freezing air. The locks had been changed. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I dropped my bag and began pounding my fist against the heavy wooden door. "Evelyn!" I yelled, my voice cracking from exhaustion. "Evelyn, open the door! The lock is jammed!" There was no answer. The house remained dead silent. I stepped back, my eyes darting to the driveway. Marcus's luxury sedan was not there, which made sense if he was actually in Miami for his supposed conference. But my stomach plummeted as the reality of the shiny new deadbolt set in. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed Marcus's number. It rang 3 times before he finally picked up. "What?" Marcus answered. His voice was not rushed, nor was it the hushed whisper of a man sitting in a corporate seminar. In the background, I could hear the soft, melodic hum of a cello, and the distinct, delicate clink of silver against fine china. Room service. He was at the St. Regis. "Marcus, my key is not working," I said, my voice trembling uncontrollably. "Someone changed the locks on the front door. Where is your mother?" "I changed the locks, Maya," Marcus said, his tone dropping into a cold, terrifyingly detached register. It was the voice of a stranger. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, gripping the porch railing to steady myself. "I just worked a 16-hour double shift. Let me into my house." "It is not your house anymore," he replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of whatever he was drinking. "I am filing for divorce, Maya. First thing Monday morning. I have already drafted the paperwork. I am citing unstable, erratic behavior and financial mismanagement. Since the mortgage has been paid out of our joint account, the account I manage, my lawyer has assured me I have a solid claim to the property. You are locked out. Do not try to break a window, or I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of his words hit me so hard I literally staggered backward. "You drained my life savings!" I screamed into the phone, the tears finally spilling over my freezing cheeks. "You stole $58,000 to buy diamonds for another woman, and now you are stealing the house I broke my back to pay for?" "I am moving on, Maya," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of remorse. "Jessica makes me feel like a man, not a hostage to a miserable, floor-scrubbing martyr. She is moving in next week. Do yourself a favor and just walk away quietly. You have nothing. You cannot afford to fight me." He hung up. The sharp beep of the disconnected line echoed in my ear. "Marcus!" I screamed at the dead phone. "Marcus!" A slight movement caught the corner of my eye. I looked up. Standing behind the sheer curtains of the living room bay window was Evelyn. She was wearing her pristine floral robe, holding a steaming mug of tea in her manicured hands. She looked down at me shivering on the porch, my uniform stained with commercial cleaning chemicals, my face streaked with tears. Evelyn slowly raised the mug to her lips, took a delicate sip, and offered me a small, chilling smirk of absolute victory. She let the curtain fall shut, plunging the house back into darkness. I was locked out, stripped of my money, my home, my marriage, and my dignity. I stood on the porch with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and a plastic name badge pinned to my chest. I stumbled down the steps, my vision blurring so heavily I could barely see my own car. I practically fell into the driver's seat of my sedan, locking the doors and burying my face against the freezing steering wheel. I wanted to scream, but I had no air left in my lungs. I drove blindly, navigating the morning traffic purely on autopilot, desperate to escape the suburban street where my entire life had just been violently erased. I drove to the only place I had left, the Sterling Towers underground parking garage. I bypassed the employee levels and drove down to the deepest, darkest sub-basement of the facility. Level B4. It was a concrete cavern of shadows, echoing silence, and freezing drafts. I parked my rattling car in the darkest corner, cut the engine, and curled up in the back seat. It was freezing. The cold seeped through the floorboards, biting into my skin, turning my fingers and toes completely numb. I pulled my thin, gray uniform jacket over my shoulders, curling into a tight, miserable ball on the cracked vinyl seats. And then, the dam finally broke. I cried until I could not breathe. I cried until my ribs ached and my throat tasted like blood. I wept for the 12 years I had wasted loving a man who had viewed me as nothing more than a bank account to be drained. I wept for the $58,000 I had literally bled for, scrubbed toilets for, ruined my knees for, all to fund his luxury hotel suites and diamond necklaces. I wept for the sheer, profound humiliation of standing on my own porch while my mother-in-law smirked at my destruction. I reached absolute rock bottom in the back of that freezing, dusty car. The irony was a bitter, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I owned the billion-dollar skyscraper towering above me. I owned the concrete I was parked on. I was Arthur Sterling's sole heir. Yet here I was, starving, freezing, and entirely broken, sleeping in a 20-year-old car like a stray animal because of a legal technicality. I lay there for hours as the day slowly faded into a bitter, freezing night. The cold was an agonizing physical pain, but the emotional devastation was infinitely worse. I wanted to close my eyes and simply surrender. It would be so easy to just give up, to let Marcus take the house, to let Julian Vance steal the company, to fade away into the invisible nothingness they all insisted I was. But as the deep, dark hours of the night ticked by, the tears slowly stopped falling. The wet tracks on my cheeks turned icy, stinging my skin. I sat up in the darkness of the car. My muscles were stiff, my joints screaming in protest. But the crushing weight of despair had been replaced by something entirely different. It started as a small, tight spark in the center of my chest, and quickly roared into a massive, consuming inferno of pure, unadulterated rage. I was Maya Sterling. I had survived 15 years of being entirely invisible. I had survived Julian Vance's psychological torture. I had survived my husband's ultimate betrayal. I was not going to die in the basement of my own empire. I forced myself out of the car. My legs shook, but I planted my feet firmly on the concrete. I took the service elevator up to the ground level, my eyes burning with a fierce, manic clarity. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, golden streaks of light through the massive glass windows of the grand lobby. I walked into the staff locker room. It was completely empty. I went to the industrial sink, turned the water to freezing cold, and aggressively splashed it over my face. I scrubbed the dried tears from my cheeks, smoothed back my disheveled hair, and looked at myself in the cracked mirror. I was pale, exhausted, and wearing a wrinkled gray uniform, but my eyes were terrifyingly sharp. I did not reach for my heavy supply belt. I did not unlock my cleaning cart. I walked out of the locker room and stepped directly into the center of the grand lobby. A few early morning junior executives were already arriving, clutching their coffees. They stared at me, a cleaner walking purposefully across the main floor without a broom or a cart. But I did not lower my head. For the first time in 15 years, I did not shrink away. I walked straight past the service corridors. I bypassed the freight elevators. I marched directly to the private, gold-plated executive elevator reserved exclusively for Julian Vance and the board of directors. A security guard stepped forward, his hand raised. "Hey, you can't be over here. That elevator is restricted." I didn't even look at him. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the sleek, encrypted black keycard Richard Gable had given me, and slammed it against the scanner. The security console chimed with a musical, welcoming trill. The heavy gold doors slid silently open. I stepped into the mahogany-lined elevator, turned around, and looked the stunned security guard dead in the eye as the doors closed, sealing me inside. I reached out and pressed the button for the 60th floor. The penthouse. It was time to meet Richard Gable. It was time to claim my throne. The heavy gold doors of the executive elevator slid shut, sealing me inside a silent, ascending vault. The only sound was the soft, expensive hum of the machinery carrying me upward at a dizzying speed. I stared at my reflection in the polished brass panels, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. I looked like an absolute disaster. My gray uniform was deeply wrinkled, stained with the harsh blue chemical spill that had cost Sarah her job just yesterday. My hair was a tangled, unkempt mess from spending a freezing, tearful night sleeping in the cramped back seat of my beat-up sedan. My eyes were rimmed with dark, bruised shadows, swollen from crying until my chest physically ached. I had hit rock bottom. I was locked out of my own home, stripped of my life savings, and discarded by a husband who was currently moving another woman into my bed. Yet, beneath the crippling physical exhaustion and the lingering sting of profound betrayal, a new, razor-sharp energy began to pulse through my veins. The tears were gone. The suffocating despair had burned away in the freezing dark of that sub-basement parking garage, leaving behind only a cold, hardened resolve. The elevator chimed a soft, melodic note. The brass doors parted to reveal the 60th floor, the legendary penthouse legal suite of Sterling Towers. The sheer opulence of the space was an immediate, jarring contrast to the grime on my uniform. The air up here was thick with the scent of rich mahogany, expensive lemon oil, and the quiet, metallic tang of old money. The carpets were incredibly plush, instantly silencing the squeak of my rubber-soled work shoes as I stepped out of the elevator bay. There were no bustling junior executives, no ringing phones, no chaotic chatter. The silence on the 60th floor was absolute, a heavily guarded fortress of power suspended high above the clouds of the city. At the far end of a long, dimly lit corridor, a pair of massive, custom-carved oak doors stood propped wide open. Inside, Richard Gable sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, his face illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a green glass banker's lamp. He looked up as I entered, his sharp, intelligent eyes scanning my disheveled appearance. He did not ask why I looked like I had slept in a car. He did not offer empty pity. He simply stood, buttoning his immaculate suit jacket, and gestured to a plush, high-backed leather chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Maya," Gable said, his voice a low, steady rumble that somehow managed to ground the frantic, nervous energy buzzing in my chest. "We have a great deal of ground to cover. I know you are physically exhausted, but you must focus your mind. Based on the hostile liquidation maneuvers Julian attempted to execute yesterday afternoon, our timeline has become infinitely more precarious." I sank into the leather chair, my aching muscles screaming in relief. "I am listening," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "I need you to understand exactly what is happening," Gable continued, folding his hands on the polished wood of his desk. "You knew that Arthur Sterling left you this building, but you do not know why, and you do not know the full, unvarnished extent of what he actually bequeathed to you." Gable stood and walked over to a heavily secured wall safe hidden behind a framed oil painting. "Arthur Sterling built this entire empire from absolutely nothing. He was a ruthless businessman, yes, but he was also a keen, unforgiving observer of human nature. 10 years ago, he realized a terrible truth. His nephew, Julian Vance, was a corrupt, entitled tyrant. Arthur knew with absolute certainty that the moment he passed away, Julian would tear this company apart. He would strip its assets, sell off the foundations, and destroy the livelihoods of thousands of hardworking people just to line his own offshore pockets. Gable pulled a thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolio from the safe and carried it back to the desk. Arthur began looking for a successor outside the bloodline. He didn't look in the boardrooms or the Ivy League universities. He looked at the foundation of his own building. He enacted a secret succession plan, and he observed you for 10 consecutive years. I sat stunned, the leather chair squeaking softly as I shifted my weight. "He watched me?" I whispered, my mind flashing back over a decade of late-night shifts, of aching knees, of scrubbing toilets and polishing marble while the city slept. "He saw everything," Gable confirmed, his tone laced with profound, genuine respect. "He saw your silent struggles. He saw you working grueling double shifts to support a husband who took you completely for granted. He saw your unrelenting work ethic. He saw you return a diamond watch left in an executive restroom without a second thought. He saw your integrity when you thought no one else was looking." Arthur believed that absolute power should not be handed to those who feel blindly entitled to it, but to those who genuinely understand the value of honest labor. Gable unclasped the leather portfolio and slid a stack of heavy, watermarked documents across the desk. Arthur bypassed his entire family. He did not just leave you Sterling Towers, Maya. He left you the primary holding company, Sterling Global Holdings. Gable paused, letting the heavy silence stretch to emphasize the magnitude of his next words. Maya, you are not just a commercial property owner. You possess the controlling, undisputed stake in a diversified portfolio of international real estate, advanced tech investments, and massive offshore capital. Your net worth, as of the execution of these documents, is approximately $1.4 billion. A billionaire. The word echoed in the quiet room, completely detached from the harsh, brutal reality of my current existence. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They were rough, heavily calloused, the cuticles cracked, peeling, and stinging from years of exposure to industrial bleach. Just a few hours ago, I had been weeping hysterically in a freezing parking garage because my husband had stolen $58,000 and locked me out of my own house. $58,000. It was literal, insignificant pocket change compared to the unimaginable wealth resting on the mahogany desk in front of me. Marcus had systematically destroyed our marriage, completely bankrupted my current reality, and betrayed my trust for a sum of money I could now generate in a single day of passive interest. Evelyn's cruel, mocking face flashed vividly in my mind. Her smug insistence that I was working-class trash, that I lacked vision, that I was dragging her brilliant son down into the gutter. I closed my eyes, letting the staggering, world-altering weight of the revelation wash over me. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a trapped, helpless wife. I was a titan. However, Gable said, his voice dropping an octave, dragging me harshly back to the present danger. There is a massive, dangerous catch. Julian Vance is not a fool, and he is backed by the most aggressive, ruthless corporate litigators on the eastern seaboard. The hostile transfer he attempted yesterday was a desperate play, but it proves he suspects Arthur hid the primary assets. Gable leaned forward, his eyes boring intensely into mine. To ensure this transfer is legally bulletproof, I have to navigate these assets through a highly complex labyrinth of international probate courts to completely shield them from Julian's lawyers. If Julian discovers your identity before I finalize the ironclad trust documents, his legal team will file immediate, devastating injunctions. They will claim Arthur was mentally incompetent when he signed these papers. They will bury the estate in endless aggressive litigation, freeze every single account, and bleed you dry with legal fees you currently cannot access the funds to fight. Gable tapped the top document with his index finger. You must keep this ownership an absolute, flawless secret for exactly 30 days. No matter what happens, no matter what Julian does to you or your staff, no matter what happens in your personal life, you cannot spend a dime, you cannot change your routine, and you cannot break character. You must remain the invisible, exhausted cleaning woman. If you break this rule, Julian will steal it all back. I stared at the signature line on the heavy, textured paper. The physical exhaustion weighing down my limbs was suddenly eclipsed by a surging, powerful adrenaline. The 30 days of silence would be pure psychological torture. I would have to endure Marcus and Evelyn's warfare without a penny to my name. I would have to watch Julian abuse my friends. But I could do it. I had survived 15 years of being entirely invisible. I could survive one more month to secure my throne and orchestrate their absolute destruction. I reached out, took the heavy gold fountain pen from Gable's desk, and signed my name. My hand shook slightly on the first letter, but the signature finished bold, sharp, and final. It is done, Gable said, carefully gathering the documents and returning them to the safe. 30 days, Maya. Be a ghost. 30 days, I repeated, my voice hoarse but fiercely resolute. I stood up, my legs aching, my spine stiff, but my head held higher than it had been in a decade. I walked out of the mahogany-lined suite, leaving the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse behind. The reality of my new existence pulsed hot beneath my skin. I was no longer just Maya, the exhausted janitor. I was a billionaire preparing for war. I walked down the long corridor toward the executive elevator. I pressed the call button, watching the brass numbers light up as the car ascended from the lower floors. The soft chime sounded, echoing loudly in the silent, empty hallway. The heavy gold doors slid open. I stepped forward, but instantly froze. The breath caught painfully in my throat, my heart violently seizing against my ribs. Standing inside the elevator, dressed in an immaculate, dark-tailored suit, his eyes narrowing with immediate, suspicious fury as they locked onto my stained gray uniform, was Julian Vance. Julian's icy blue eyes dropped from the polished mahogany paneling of the penthouse suite directly to the stained, wrinkled fabric of my gray uniform. The silence in the elevator car was absolute, thick with a sudden, suffocating tension. For a fraction of a second, the blood roared in my ears so loudly I thought I might faint. I was holding a pen that had just signed away his empire. My fingerprints were practically still warm on the billion-dollar trust documents sitting in the safe just 50 feet behind him. "What the hell are you doing on this floor?" Julian's voice was a venomous, quiet hiss. He stepped fully into the elevator, his custom-tailored Italian suit practically radiating an aura of untouchable wealth. He looked at me not as a human being, but as a piece of trash that had somehow blown into his pristine sanctuary. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but 15 years of practice kicked in. I immediately dropped my chin, shrinking my posture, letting my shoulders slump into the familiar, exhausted hunch of a terrified subordinate. I kept my eyes pinned to the expensive leather of his shoes. I am so sorry, sir," I stammered, letting my voice waver with genuine exhaustion. "I was looking for the overflow supply closet. Maintenance dispatch told me it was on floor 6. I must have leaned on the 60 button by accident. I am so sorry." Julian stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. I could feel his gaze crawling over my unkempt hair, the chemical stains on my apron, the dark, bruised bags under my eyes. He let out a sharp, incredulous scoff, shaking his head in profound disgust. "You people are barely literate," Julian sneered, stepping past me to press the button for the lobby. "If I ever see you on the executive levels again, I won't just fire you. I will make sure you are blacklisted from every commercial cleaning agency in this city. Now get out of my sight before you contaminate the air." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." I practically scrambled out of the elevator, backing into the service corridor just as the heavy gold doors slid shut. The moment the lock clicked, my knees gave out. I slumped against the cold, concrete wall of the service stairwell, dragging oxygen into my burning lungs. I had survived. The illusion held. Julian Vance, the ruthless corporate shark who thought he was 10 steps ahead of everyone, had looked directly at the woman who now owned his entire world, and he had seen absolutely nothing. The 30-day countdown had officially begun. An hour later, my phone vibrated with an encrypted text from Richard Gable. It contained a digital key code and an address located in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood just outside the city limits. A secure property owned by a subsidiary of the estate, the message read. Untraceable, safe, keep your head down. When I arrived at the address, I found a modest, furnished one-bedroom apartment. It was not a sprawling mansion or a luxury penthouse. It had laminate flooring, simple beige walls, and a small, functional kitchen. But as I locked the heavy steel deadbolt behind me, a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over my trembling body. It was warm, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was utterly impenetrable. Neither Marcus nor Julian could reach me here. I stripped off my chemical-soaked uniform, stood under a scalding hot shower until my skin turned pink, and collapsed into the clean, crisp sheets of the bed. For the first time since my entire life had violently shattered, I slept without dreaming. When I woke, the brutal, relentless rhythm of my new double life began. By night, I was still Maya the invisible ghost. I strapped on my heavy supply belt, loaded my industrial cart, and scrubbed the miles of marble and glass inside Sterling Towers. But the physical pain of the labor no longer crushed my spirit. Every agonizing sweep of the mop, every burn of bleach against my calloused hands, was now a calculated, deliberate act of war. I was not just cleaning, I was hunting. I moved silently through the executive corridors, a phantom hiding in plain sight. I emptied trash cans in conference rooms, memorizing discarded memos. I wiped down break room counters while junior executives gossiped about Julian's erratic behavior. I watched, I listened, and I cataloged every single vulnerability in the corporate structure. Because no one ever looks twice at the cleaning lady, no one bothered to lower their voice when I was in the room. They handed me their secrets on a silver platter. By day, I transformed. I met Richard Gable in a secure off-site secondary office buried in the financial district. Behind closed doors, the polite, reserved attorney morphed into a ruthless, brilliant instructor. We engaged in intense, accelerated, grueling sessions that pushed my brain to its absolute limits. Arthur Sterling had seen my raw intelligence, but Richard was tasked with sharpening it into a lethal weapon. I sat at a massive conference table buried under towering stacks of financial ledgers, corporate bylaws, and real estate portfolios. Richard taught me the intricate, bloodthirsty mechanics of holding companies, subsidiary trusts, and international capital gains. I learned how Julian was currently manipulating the board of directors, how he was artificially inflating stock prices, and how he used aggressive intimidation tactics to silence dissenting shareholders. The learning curve was vertical and punishing, but my mind devoured the information with a ravenous, desperate hunger. I was not just memorizing numbers, I was mapping out the battlefield. Every time a complex legal concept clicked into place, I saw a new, brilliant spark of approval in Richard's eyes. I was not the uneducated, pathetic martyr Evelyn claimed I was. I was Arthur Sterling's true, undeniable heir, and I was learning exactly how to wield his sword. But maintaining the discipline to hide this surging, intoxicating power was absolute psychological torture. 2 weeks into the 30-day waiting period, the reality of my former life reared its ugly, vicious head. I was walking back to my secure apartment after a grueling training session when a man in a cheap suit stepped out from behind a parked car and shoved a thick manila envelope into my chest. "Maya Vance?" he asked, not waiting for an answer before turning and walking away. "You've been served." I carried the envelope inside, locked the door, and tore it open at my small kitchen table. It was Marcus's divorce petition. Reading the legal documents was an exercise in swallowing pure, acidic rage. The paperwork was a masterpiece of predatory greed. Marcus, backed by his mother's vicious influence, had filed for absolute control over every asset from our marriage. He demanded the house, claiming my financial instability made me unfit to maintain the mortgage. He demanded the meager contents of our joint savings account, the exact account he had already illegally drained to buy a diamond necklace for his mistress. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the final clause nearly made me tear the document to shreds. Marcus was requesting that I be legally barred from seeking any form of alimony, citing his need to rebuild his life after years of supporting an unmotivated, financially dependent spouse. My hands shook violently, the thick legal paper rattling in my grip. I wanted to grab my phone. I wanted to call him, to scream into the receiver, to casually mention the $1.4 billion currently clearing international probate in my name. I wanted to tell him that his entire existence was a rounding error on my daily interest. But Richard's voice echoed in the back of my mind, a stern, unyielding command. 30 days. Be a ghost. I forced my hands to relax. I smoothed out the wrinkled divorce petition and set it neatly on the laminate table. Let Marcus think he had won. Let Evelyn gloat in her pristine living room. Let them dig their own graves with their boundless, blinding arrogance. When the 30 days were up, I wouldn't just contest the divorce. I would unleash a financial apocalypse that would leave them begging for mercy. I channeled that burning, suppressed rage directly into my nighttime surveillance. As the days ticked down, the atmosphere inside Sterling Towers grew increasingly frantic. Julian Vance was escalating. During my night shifts on the 58th floor, I began piecing together fragments of hushed, panicked conversations between his loyal executives. Julian was moving too fast. He was planning something massive, something entirely reckless. I scrubbed the baseboards outside a private meeting room, my ear angled toward the heavy mahogany door. Julian was boasting to his inner circle. He was preparing to announce a massive, aggressive corporate merger. He intended to liquidate 3 of Arthur Sterling's foundational, highly profitable subsidiaries to fund a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm. It was a vanity project, a desperate, egotistical maneuver designed to cement his own legacy while completely dismantling his uncle's empire for quick, untraceable cash. He was going to destroy the company before I could legally take the reins. The tension in my chest pulled agonizingly tight. I only had 8 days left until the trust cleared, but Julian was preparing to strike in 5. If he liquidated those foundational assets, thousands of people would lose their jobs, and the structural integrity of Sterling Global Holdings would be permanently crippled. I had to find a way to stall him. I needed leverage, something so volatile it would force him to pause his maneuvers without exposing my true identity. On the 24th night of my countdown, I found it. Julian's private office was currently relocated to the 59th floor, while the penthouse underwent a lavish, completely unnecessary renovation. It was past 2 in the morning. The executive level was entirely deserted, bathed in the eerie, silent glow of emergency lighting. I pushed my cleaning cart into Julian's temporary office, the heavy door clicking shut behind me. The space was an arrogant shrine to his ego, cluttered with expensive modern art and imported leather furniture. I moved methodically, emptying the heavy brass trash cans and wiping down the expansive glass desk. As I knelt to polish the base of a massive antique oak credenza behind his desk, my rag snagged on a sharp edge. I frowned, running my fingers along the bottom panel. It wasn't a solid piece of wood. It was a false bottom, and it had been left slightly, carelessly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. Julian was arrogant, but he was rarely sloppy. He must have been in a rush when he left the building. I glanced nervously over my shoulder at the closed office door. The silence was absolute. My hands trembling, I wedged my fingers into the narrow gap and carefully pulled the false wooden panel forward. It slid out smoothly on hidden tracks. Inside the dark, narrow cavity lay a single, thick, black, leather-bound ledger. I wiped my hands on my apron, my breath catching in my throat as I reached in and pulled the heavy book out. I set it on the glass desk, flicked on a small reading lamp, and opened the cover. It was not a record of corporate secrets or merger strategies. It was something infinitely worse. The pages were filled with columns of meticulously handwritten numbers, dates, and offshore routing codes. My eyes darted across the headers, my brain instantly applying the intense, aggressive training Richard had hammered into me over the past 3 weeks. I recognized the account structures. I recognized the dummy corporations. My blood ran completely terrifyingly cold. Julian was not just preparing to liquidate company assets. He was actively, systematically siphoning money from the Sterling Employee Pension Fund. He was stealing millions of dollars from the very workers who scrubbed his floors, maintained his servers, and built his empire, routing their retirement savings into untraceable Cayman Island accounts to artificially inflate his own personal wealth. I stared at the staggering, illegal numbers, my heart pounding a violent rhythm against my ribs. This was not just leverage, this was a nuclear bomb. But as I reached for my phone to photograph the damning pages, the heavy brass handle of the office door slowly began to turn. The heavy brass handle of Julian's office door rotated with a sickening metallic click. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to an excruciating crawl. The adrenaline flooding my system was so icy and absolute that it bypassed panic and crystallized into pure, hyper-focused survival instinct. I had less than 3 seconds. My hand darted to my pocket, pulling out my phone. I swiped the screen, ensuring the flash and shutter sound were deactivated, and held it over the open ledger. Click, click, click. I captured 3 high-resolution images of the most damning pages, the ones detailing the massive 8-figure transfers from the Employee Pension Fund into an offshore Cayman routing account. The door unlatched, pushing inward. I shoved the heavy leather book back into the dark cavity of the credenza, slammed the false wooden bottom flush against its hidden tracks, and snatched my spray bottle. I dropped to my knees, aggressively spritzing the lower mahogany panels and furiously wiping them down with my microfiber cloth, just as the door swung completely open. "What are you still doing in here?" I flinched, playing the role of the terrified subordinate perfectly. I peered over my shoulder, keeping my chin tucked toward my chest. It wasn't Julian. It was Elias Vance, Julian's younger brother, and the acting vice president of acquisitions. He was flushed, his tie loosened, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and stale cigar smoke. "I apologize, sir," I stammered, keeping my eyes glued to the scuffed toes of his imported leather shoes. "Someone spilled coffee behind the credenza. It was sticky. I am just finishing the baseboards now. The trash is already cleared." Elias swayed slightly, staring down at me with an expression of profound, exhausted irritation. To him, I was not a threat. I was not even a person. I was simply a piece of the building's infrastructure, no more significant than the lamp on the desk or the carpet under his feet. "Make it quick," he snapped, walking over to the filing cabinet to retrieve a manila folder before turning back toward the door. "And turn the lights off when you leave. The electric bill in this tower is already a hemorrhage." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." The door clicked shut behind him. I stayed on my knees for a full minute, my chest heaving, listening to the fading echo of his footsteps down the corridor. Once the silence returned, I pulled my phone from my apron pocket. The photos were crystal clear. The numbers were undeniable. I slipped the phone securely into my bra, strapped my supply belt back on, and wheeled my cart out of the penthouse. 4 hours later, the sun was rising over the city, and I was sitting in the heavily secured, windowless war room of Richard Gable's off-site legal office. Richard stared at the tablet screen where I had uploaded the images. For a long time, the seasoned, unflappable attorney said absolutely nothing. The silence in the room was dense, vibrating with the magnitude of what we were looking at. When he finally looked up at me, the stoic mask he always wore had fractured, revealing a profound, simmering rage. "He isn't just liquidating the foundational assets to fund a vanity merger," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rumble. "He is bleeding the employee pension fund dry to cover his own personal lifestyle. These offshore routing numbers. Maya, this is a direct, flagrant violation of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. He is actively stealing the retirement savings of thousands of working-class people to buy private jets, overseas villas, and untraceable shell companies." The reality of Julian's corruption settled heavily over my shoulders. I thought of the women I worked with on the night shift. I thought of Maria, who had scrubbed these floors for 20 years and was counting on her pension to pay for her husband's medical care. Julian was not just stealing my inheritance. He was cannibalizing the futures of the very people who kept his empire standing. "We have to stop him," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "Richard, if he completes the merger next week, the pension deficit will be permanently buried under the new corporate structure. He will get away with it." "He will not," Richard replied, his eyes flashing. "But we must be incredibly disciplined. If we alert the authorities or the board of directors right now, Julian will immediately realize there is a leak. He will burn the physical evidence, scramble the offshore accounts, and use his high-priced litigators to tie up the investigation for a decade. Worse, it will expose your presence before the 30-day probate period is complete, allowing him to contest your ownership of the holding company." "So what do we do?" "We initiate a quiet, parallel forensic audit," Richard said, pulling out a secure, encrypted laptop. "I am bringing in a trusted, independent forensic accountant. We will use these routing numbers to trace the digital paper trail backward. We will build an airtight, bulletproof dossier of federal crimes. When the 30-day clock strikes zero, we will not just seize the company from him. We will hand him directly over to the FBI." Over the next 2 weeks, the off-site legal suite became my entire world. By night, I maintained the grueling facade, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans, keeping my ear to the ground for any whisper of Julian's movements. By day, I sat in the war room alongside Richard and his forensic accountant, a quiet, brilliant man named Eris. I underwent an intense, accelerated education. I learned how to read complex balance sheets, how to track capital gains through international tax havens, and how to dissect corporate bylaws. The knowledge absorbed into my brain like water into parched earth. Arthur Sterling had been right about me. The relentless, grueling survival skills I had honed over 15 years of poverty translated perfectly into corporate strategy. I was meticulous. I was patient. And I understood the fundamental mechanics of leverage. The progress felt earned. Every late night, every headache, every hour spent deciphering legal jargon only sharpened the weapon I was forging myself into. But as the days ticked by, the ghosts of my past continued to haunt the periphery of my new existence. On the 18th day of the countdown, I arrived at the war room to find Richard waiting for me with a thick, physical dossier resting on the conference table. He did not open his laptop. He simply pushed the file across the polished wood. "I instructed my private investigative team to run a standard, comprehensive threat assessment on your estranged husband," Richard explained, his tone carefully neutral. "We needed to ensure Marcus could not track your movements to the safe house or inadvertently expose your identity to Julian's people. The security sweep is complete. You are perfectly safe, but the investigator uncovered several personal details that I believed you had a right to see." My heart gave a strange, hollow flutter. I reached out and opened the dossier. The first page was a background check on Jessica, the young, beautiful woman Marcus had moved into my home, only her name was not Jessica. "Her legal name is Chloe Vance," Richard said softly. "No relation to Julian, purely a coincidence. She is 26 years old, and she is a known, documented grifter. She has 3 prior civil judgments against her in 2 different states for wire fraud and romantic con schemes." I stared at the mugshot attached to the file, my breath catching in my throat. I flipped to the next page. It was a comprehensive financial breakdown of Marcus's current bank accounts, including the joint savings account he had illegally drained to fund his new life. "The $58,000 Marcus stole from you?" Richard continued, pointing to a highlighted bank transfer. "He didn't just use it to buy her a diamond necklace. He dumped the vast majority of it into an exclusive commercial real estate venture that she brought to him. The venture does not exist. It is a ghost LLC, registered to a post office box in the Bahamas. The money is gone, Maya. It vanished the moment the wire cleared." I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted financial records. Marcus had lost it. He had taken my life savings, the money I had literally destroyed my body to earn, and he had handed it directly to a con artist who had played his arrogant, fragile ego like a cheap fiddle. "It gets worse for him," Richard said, his voice lacking any sympathy. "Marcus's personal credit cards are entirely maxed out from the luxury hotel suites and the expensive dinners he used to court her. In a desperate attempt to recoup the lost investment before the bank realized he was insolvent, he convinced his mother to help him." I looked up, my eyes wide. "Evelyn?" "Evelyn," Richard confirmed. 2 weeks ago, Evelyn took out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on her pristine suburban home. She handed the capital directly to Marcus, who immediately sank it into a secondary recovery fund that Chloe recommended. That money is also gone. They are completely, irrecoverably bankrupt. The bank has already initiated the preliminary stages of foreclosure on Evelyn's property. A profound, chilling silence settled over the room. I looked down at the paperwork. For weeks, the agonizing, burning desire for revenge had kept me awake. I had fantasized about the moment the 30-day clock expired, dreaming of the day I could walk into the house Marcus had locked me out of, slap a billion-dollar bank statement onto his chest, and crush him into the dirt. I had wanted to destroy Evelyn's smug, arrogant world. But sitting in the quiet safety of the war room, staring at the cold, hard proof of their absolute ruin, the burning need for vengeance simply evaporated. I felt a sudden, overwhelmingly serene wave of validation. I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. I did not have to plot their financial ruin or orchestrate a grand, dramatic retaliation. Their own boundless greed, their toxic arrogance, and their desperate need to feel superior to me had done all the work. They had dug their own graves, climbed inside, and buried themselves alive. "They have absolutely nothing," I whispered, the realization washing over me like cool water. "They are drowning in the consequences of their own actions," Richard agreed, closing the file. "You are completely insulated from the blast radius. Let them sink, Maya. Keep your eyes on the Empire." I left the legal suite that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in a decade. The bitter, biting cold of the impending winter felt crisp and invigorating against my skin as I took the subway back to my secure, estate-owned apartment building. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple, a cold rain beginning to fall as I walked the final 2 blocks to my quiet neighborhood. I turned the corner, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders as I approached the secure iron gate of my apartment complex. A shadow detached itself from the brick wall near the entrance. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand instantly dropping into my pocket to grasp the heavy metal flashlight I carried for protection. The figure stepped into the pale, flickering glow of the street lamp. It was Marcus. He looked like absolute garbage. The sharp, immaculate tailoring of his expensive suit was completely ruined, the fabric wrinkled, soaked through with rain, and stained at the cuffs. His normally perfect hair was a disheveled, matted mess. He was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, wide, and darting with a frantic, unhinged desperation. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to the ground. He saw me standing on the sidewalk and let out a broken, ragged gasp. He lunged forward, collapsing to his knees on the wet concrete right at my feet, the rain soaking into his trousers. "Maya," he sobbed, his voice cracking, reaching out with shaking hands to grasp the hem of my coat. "Maya, please, please, you have to help me. I made a terrible, terrible mistake." The icy rain slashed sideways through the amber glow of the street lamp, plastering Marcus's ruined, expensive hair to his forehead. He remained on his knees on the slick, oil-stained concrete, his designer suit saturated and clinging to his shivering frame. He reached through the iron bars of the apartment gate, his wet fingers grasping desperately at the empty air inches from my coat. "She tricked me, Maya," Marcus wailed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched panic I had never heard from him before. Chloe is a monster. She's a professional criminal. She manipulated my accounts, she forged investment portfolios, she stole my entire future. I was confused. I was under so much pressure at the firm, and you were always working those night shifts, and she took advantage of my stress. He stared up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and overflowing with tears. He was waiting for the reflex. He was waiting for the deeply ingrained, pathetic instinct that had governed my life for 12 years. The instinct to drop to my knees, wrap my arms around him, absorb his pain, and carry his burdens. He was waiting for me to be the reliable, invisible safety net he could blindly fall into. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the man who had stolen my life savings, locked me out of my own home, and discarded me for a younger woman. I waited for the familiar spike of adrenaline, the flush of anger, or the agonizing ache of betrayal. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing. For the first time in over a decade, I looked at Marcus and felt a profound, echoing emptiness. The heavy, suffocating chains of obligation and guilt had simply dissolved. He was no longer my husband. He was no longer my responsibility. He was just a pathetic, shivering stranger crying on a sidewalk. "I love you, Maya," he begged, his voice dropping into a raspy, theatrical whisper as he pressed his wet face against the cold iron bars. "You are my rock. You've always been my rock. We took vows, for better or for worse, remember? We can fix this. We can go to counseling. Just open the gate. Please, Maya. I have absolutely nothing left." I didn't brag about the billions currently clearing in my name. I didn't mention the high-powered lawyers or the penthouse suite. He wasn't worth the breath it would take to say the words. "You aren't sorry, Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through the sound of the freezing rain. "You are just broke. You didn't come here because you love me. You came here because you need a host." His jaw dropped, shock registering through his panic. "How can you be so cold?" he stammered, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "After everything we've shared? Maya, I am out in the freezing rain." "Then you should probably buy an umbrella," I replied softly. I turned my back on him and walked toward the entrance of my building. "Maya!" he screamed, his voice turning ugly and vicious as the facade of the repentant husband instantly shattered. "You can't do this to me. You owe me. You're nothing without me. You hear me? Nothing." The heavy steel door of the lobby clicked shut behind me, completely severing his frantic screaming. I walked up the 2 flights of stairs to my secure apartment, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped into the quiet warmth of my living room. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the rain streak against the glass. I had never felt so utterly beautifully free. The final week of the waiting period dissolved into a blur of relentless clinical preparation. With the emotional wreckage of my marriage firmly in the rearview mirror, my mind became a steel trap, completely dedicated to the impending destruction of Julian Vance. On the morning of the 30th day, the atmosphere inside Richard Gable's subterranean war room was electric. The air was thick with the smell of strong black coffee and the quiet, rapid clicking of keyboards. Aris, the forensic accountant, sat surrounded by towering stacks of highlighted financial documents, his eyes glued to a wall of glowing monitors. Richard stood at the head of the massive mahogany conference table. He was not wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, his posture rigid with intense focus. He stared at a digital clock displayed on the primary screen. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. A heavy, definitive chime echoed from Richard's encrypted laptop. Richard slowly exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a month. He pressed a single button on his keyboard, then looked up, his sharp eyes locking directly onto mine. "The international probate courts have rubber-stamped the final filings," Richard announced, his voice a low, steady rumble of absolute triumph. The legal shielding is locked. The trust is impenetrable. Julian's litigators cannot file injunctions. They cannot claim mental incompetence, and they cannot freeze the capital. The transfer is legally, irreversibly complete. He picked up a heavy, watermarked folder and slid it across the polished wood of the conference table. Maya, you are now the undisputed sole controlling owner of Sterling Global Holdings, Richard said. The buildings, the subsidiaries, the international real estate, the tech patents, it is all yours. You possess absolute, total executive authority. I rested my rough, calloused hands on the crisp leather portfolio. The sheer, staggering weight of the power now coursing through my name was almost physically overwhelming. The ghost had finally materialized. "What about the forensic audit?" I asked, my voice hard and steady. "What about the pension fund?" Iris swiveled his chair away from the monitors, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "We have built a flawless, bulletproof federal dossier," he confirmed, tapping a thick stack of bound paper. "Julian's offshore routing codes have been completely decrypted. We have irrefutable proof that he embezzled $42 million directly from the employee retirement accounts to fund his shell companies and personal real estate acquisitions. The paper trail is a masterpiece of corporate fraud. I have already established a secure, direct line of communication with the white-collar crimes division of the FBI. They are standing by for the signal." "Julian is out of time," Richard said, checking his heavy silver wristwatch. "But unfortunately, he doesn't know it yet. His arrogance is peaking." Richard tapped a remote, bringing up a live security feed from the ground floor of Sterling Towers. My breath hitched. The legendary, sprawling marble lobby of the skyscraper had been entirely transformed into a chaotic, opulent staging ground. Velvet ropes sectioned off the main concourse. Massive, high-definition screens displayed the Sterling logo, flanked by the logo of the rival tech firm Julian intended to aggressively swallow. Caterers in crisp white uniforms circulated with trays of expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres. At the center of the lobby, a raised, brilliantly lit stage had been constructed, complete with a polished acrylic podium and a forest of microphones. Julian had mandated that every single department head, every executive, and hundreds of lower-level corporate employees be present. They were currently filing into the lobby, standing shoulder to shoulder behind the velvet ropes. Their faces were tight with anxiety, fully aware that the impending announcement likely meant mass layoffs and corporate butchery. Positioned directly in front of the stage was a swarm of local and national financial news crews. Tripods were locked in place. Camera lenses were focused on the empty podium. The bright, blinding glare of television lighting washed out the rich gold and marble tones of the lobby. Julian Vance was throwing himself a coronation. He intended to stand in front of the cameras, the press, and the very employees he was actively robbing to announce the hostile merger that would permanently gut his uncle's empire and bury his pension theft forever. He wanted an audience for his masterpiece of corporate destruction. "He's scheduled to step up to the podium in exactly 45 minutes, Richard said, watching the live feed with undisguised disgust. "He believes he holds all the cards. He believes the board of directors is terrified of him. He believes he is completely untouchable." I stared at the screen, watching the sea of anxious employees being forced to clap for the man orchestrating their ruin. I recognized Maria standing near the back, looking terrified. I recognized the security guards who had nodded to me on my night shifts. These were my people. This was my building. "I need you to stay here, Richard," I said, my voice dropping into a tone of quiet, absolute authority that I had never heard myself use before. "When I give the signal, transmit the forensic dossier directly to the federal authorities. Do not give his lawyers a single second to breathe." Richard nodded, a fierce, respectful glint in his eyes. "And what will you be doing, you be?" I turned away from the monitors, my heart perfectly steady, my mind crystal clear. "I'm going to attend a press conference." 30 minutes later, I stood in the humid, dimly lit sub-basement locker room of Sterling Towers. The air smelled faintly of industrial bleach and damp concrete. I opened my battered metal locker. Hanging inside was my wrinkled, heavily stained gray cleaning uniform. I stripped off my street clothes. I pulled the rough, scratchy cotton shirt over my head. I buttoned the oversized gray trousers. I stepped into my scuffed, squeaky, rubber-soled work shoes. I reached into the locker and pulled out my heavy, black canvas supply belt, buckling it tightly around my waist. The familiar weight of the spray bottles, the rags, and the scraper settled against my hips. I tied my unkempt hair back into a messy, frayed knot. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror mounted on the locker door. I looked exactly like what Evelyn claimed I was. I looked exactly like what Marcus had discarded. I looked exactly like the illiterate, invisible trash Julian had sneered at in the penthouse elevator. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my uniform trousers. I pulled it out. The screen illuminated the dim concrete room. It was a single encrypted text message from Richard Gable. "Execute." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I grabbed the handle of my heavy yellow plastic mop bucket. The squeaky, rattling wheels echoed loudly against the concrete floor as I pushed it out of the locker room and toward the service elevator. I pressed the call button for the main lobby. The doors slid open. I stepped inside, the fluorescent light flickering overhead as the car began its ascent. I was no longer hiding in the shadows. I was walking directly into the blinding glare of the flashbulbs, and I was going to burn Julian Vance's empire to the ground. The brass numbers above the elevator door lit up in descending order, a steady, rhythmic countdown to the battlefield. 50, 40, 30. With every floor that passed, my pulse steadied, the frantic, nervous energy burning away into a cold, diamond-hard focus. I adjusted the heavy black canvas supply belt strapped to my hips. The spray bottles clanked softly against each other. The smell of industrial bleach and ammonia radiating from my stained uniform was sharp and grounding. It was the scent of my camouflage, the scent of 15 years of invisibility, the scent of the ghost that was about to haunt Julian Vance for the rest of his miserable life. 10, 5, 3. The elevator groaned softly as it decelerated, the braking mechanism engaging with a heavy shudder. The soft, melodic chime rang out, completely out of place against the violent storm brewing in my chest. The gold doors slid apart, instantly immersing me in a wall of sound and blinding, chaotic light. The sprawling, legendary main lobby of Sterling Towers was unrecognizable. The vast expanse of imported Italian marble was packed with hundreds of bodies. To my left, corralled behind thick, burgundy velvet ropes, stood the corporate employees. I saw the faces of the men and women I had silently worked alongside for over a decade. Data analysts, security guards, mailroom clerks, and maintenance staff. Maria, the night shift supervisor, was gripping the rope, her face pale and drawn with the terror of impending unemployment. They were packed together like cattle forced to serve as a silent, captive audience for their own professional execution. To my right, a sea of local and national financial press surged against the barricades. Camera flashes popped like strobe lights, temporarily blinding me. Reporters murmured rapidly into microphones, their camera operators tracking the center of the room. There, elevated on a brilliantly lit acrylic stage, stood Julian Vance. He was in his absolute element. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue suit that probably cost more than Maria's annual salary. His hair was impeccably styled, not a single strand out of place. He was holding a steaming cup of coffee in a delicate, gold-rimmed porcelain saucer, brought down from the executive suite so he wouldn't have to suffer the indignity of a paper cup. He was laughing, flashing his brilliant, predatory smile at a reporter in the front row, projecting the image of a visionary corporate savior ready to usher in a bold new era. He was a king holding court in a stolen castle. I stepped out of the elevator bay, gripping the handle of my yellow plastic mop bucket. I did not hug the wall. I did not shrink into the shadows. I pushed the heavy cart directly into the main concourse. The front left wheel of the cart was notoriously defective. It shrieked. A high-pitched, metallic, rhythmic squeak that echoed sharply over the low hum of the crowd. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Heads began to turn. A cameraman lowered his lens, frowning in confusion. A junior executive standing near the stage blinked, his jaw dropping slightly as he stared at the woman in the filthy gray uniform pushing a mop bucket directly through the pristine, highly orchestrated press area. Julian heard it. He paused mid-laugh, turning his head toward the sound. His icy blue eyes locked onto me, and the manufactured, charming smile instantly vanished, replaced by a contortion of pure, unadulterated fury. The sheer audacity of a janitor entering his perfectly curated frame, ruining the aesthetic of his historic announcement, was too much for his fragile, bloated ego to process. He handed his porcelain saucer to a terrified assistant, but kept the steaming cup in his right hand. He stepped off the stage, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble as he marched directly toward me. The murmur of the crowd died. The cameras pivoted, lenses tracking his movement. The silence in the massive lobby became absolute, suffocating, and heavy. I stopped the cart exactly 10 feet from the stage, right in the center of the open floor. I kept my hands resting lightly on the mop handle, watching him approach. "What in the name of God do you think you are doing?" Julian hissed, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, amplified by the ambient microphone stationed near the podium. "Who let you up here? Who authorized this?" I didn't lower my chin. I didn't drop my gaze to his shoes. I looked directly into his furious blue eyes. Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The fact that I was not cowering, that I was looking at him as an equal, triggered a violent snap in his psyche. He did not just want me gone. He wanted to destroy me. He wanted to use me as a prop, a physical demonstration of his absolute, unquestionable power over the lower classes. "Look at this," Julian sneered, turning his body slightly so his profile was visible to the flashing cameras. He gestured toward me with his free hand, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "This is exactly what I am talking about. This is the rot I am carving out of my uncle's legacy. Utter, profound incompetence." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, towering over me. I could smell the expensive cologne radiating from his skin. "You are an invisible, worthless maid," Julian spat, the words laced with a venom so toxic it made the junior executives behind him physically flinch. "You exist only to clean up the messes made by people who actually matter. You are a stain on this building. You are uneducated, incompetent trash, and you have no right to breathe the air on this floor. I am the future of Sterling Global, and you are fired. Do you understand me? You are completely, permanently—" Julian didn't finish the sentence. To assert his final, absolute dominance in front of the rolling cameras, to physically humiliate me into the submission he felt he was owed, Julian snapped his wrist forward. He hurled the contents of his porcelain cup directly at my chest. The scalding hot coffee hit me with a heavy, wet slap. The dark, searing liquid splashed across my collarbone, instantly soaking through the thin gray cotton of my uniform shirt and running down the front of my stained apron. The heat flared sharply against my skin, a sudden burning sting that radiated outward. The porcelain cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor and shattering into a dozen jagged white pieces. The sharp crash echoed through the dead silence of the lobby like a gunshot. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the crowd. Maria covered her mouth with both hands, tears springing to her eyes. The press corps froze, camera shutters temporarily halted in sheer shock. Even the sycophantic executives standing behind the velvet ropes looked nauseated by the sheer, unhinged cruelty of the assault. Julian stood there, his chest heaving, his blue eyes burning with a sadistic, triumphant light. He waited for me to break. He waited for me to burst into humiliated tears, to drop to my knees and desperately attempt to clean up the shattered porcelain, to run sobbing toward the service exit while the cameras captured my absolute defeat. I did none of those things. The burning heat soaking into my skin was nothing. It was a microscopic fraction of the agony I had endured over the past decade. It was nothing compared to the freezing nights in my car, nothing compared to the chemical burns on my hands, nothing compared to the betrayal of my marriage. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the oxygen expand my lungs. I let go of the mop handle. The heavy wooden pole swung backward, hitting the side of the plastic yellow bucket with a loud, definitive crack. I slowly squared my shoulders, rolling my spine upward, shedding the exhausted, hunched posture of the invisible maid like a discarded snakeskin. I lifted my chin, tilting my head back until my eyes were perfectly level with his. The terrified, submissive mask I had worn for 15 years fractured, shattered, and fell away, revealing the cold, hardened titan beneath. I reached up with 2 fingers and calmly, deliberately wiped a single drop of brown coffee from my jawline. I did not blink. I stared at him with an expression of such pure, terrifying authority that Julian's triumphant smile faltered. A microscopic flicker of uncertainty passed through his eyes. He took a half step backward, his brain suddenly registering that the prey he had just cornered was not acting like prey. "You are done," I said. My voice was not a shout. It was not a scream. It was a low, perfectly modulated, razor-sharp command that cut through the silence of the massive lobby with surgical precision. I reached my hand into the deep front pocket of my soaked, coffee-stained apron. My fingers bypassed the steel scraper and the damp microfiber rags, closing around the heavy, folded stack of watermarked paper I had tucked inside just before leaving the locker room. I pulled the documents free. The thick, textured parchment caught the glare of the television lights, the embossed gold seal of the International Probate Court flashing brilliantly. Julian's eyes dropped to the papers in my hand. His brow furrowed, genuine confusion finally eclipsing his arrogant rage. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice losing its theatrical projection, dropping into a harsh, uncertain whisper. "What are you doing?" I did not answer him. I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the exact moment his reality began to fracture. I lifted the heavy documents slowly, deliberately unfolding the crisp pages to reveal the bold black signatures at the bottom. The undisputed, notarized deed of total ownership for Sterling Global Holdings. Behind Julian, at the far end of the massive lobby, the heavy, revolving glass doors at the main entrance suddenly ceased spinning. They were pushed forcefully open, locked back on their hinges. The cold winter air rushed into the heated lobby, immediately followed by the sharp, synchronized sound of dozens of heavy boots hitting the marble floor. Richard Gable stepped through the entrance, no longer looking like a quiet corporate attorney. He looked like an executioner. And flanking him on all sides, moving with swift, tactical precision, were 20 agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs, followed closely by Eris and a team of federal forensic auditors clutching heavy silver briefcases. The synchronized, heavy footfalls of 20 federal agents echoing across the imported Italian marble of the lobby sounded like the beating of a massive collective drum. the sea of local and national financial press, previously jockeying for the best camera angles of Julian's historic announcement, instinctively parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled to pull their tripods and boom microphones out of the way, their camera lenses rapidly pivoting from the acrylic stage to the phalanx of dark windbreakers advancing through the main concourse. The silence in the room deepened, transforming from a tense hush into a suffocating atmospheric vacuum. The only sounds were the rhythmic marching of the agents, the mechanical whir of camera shutters firing in rapid succession, and the erratic, ragged breathing of Julian Vance. Richard Gable did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the terrified corporate employees huddled behind the velvet ropes. His piercing, hawkish gaze was locked entirely on Julian. Julian's face had completely drained of color, his perfectly manicured features slackening into a mask of profound, uncomprehending shock. He looked from the watermarked, gold-embossed probate deed in my hand to the federal agents fanning out across the lobby floor, securing the perimeter and blocking the massive revolving doors. Richard bypassed me, walking directly up the carpeted steps of the brilliantly lit stage. He did not ask for permission. He did not wait for an introduction. He stepped up to the acrylic podium, adjusted the cluster of microphones with calm, deliberate precision, and looked out over the sea of flashing cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press and employees of Sterling Global," Richard's voice boomed through the towering lobby, his rich baritone register resonating with absolute, unshakable legal authority. "My name is Richard Gable. I am the senior managing partner of Gable, Thorne and Associates and the primary executor of the estate of the late Arthur Sterling." A collective murmur rippled through the press corps. Microphones were thrust higher into the air. The bright, blinding glare of television lighting intensified as cameramen adjusted their exposures to capture the man interrupting the coronation. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the mandatory 30-day probate period mandated by Mr. Sterling's last will and testament has officially expired, Richard announced, his voice slicing through the rising whispers. The international probate courts have finalized the transfer of all assets. Therefore, this scheduled press conference regarding a corporate merger is hereby canceled. Julian Vance holds no executive authority to negotiate, sell, or merge any subsidiary of this enterprise. "That is a lie!" Julian shrieked, the sound tearing from his throat in a raw, panicked falsetto that completely shattered his suave, untouchable persona. He lunged toward the podium, pointing a trembling finger at Richard. "Turn the cameras off. All of you, turn them off right now. This man is a fraud. He is a disgruntled former employee of my uncle." Richard did not even flinch. He did not step back. He simply placed his hands flat on the edges of the podium and continued speaking into the microphones, ignoring Julian as if he were nothing more than a buzzing insect. "I am officially announcing that Julian Vance is hereby terminated from his position as acting CEO, effective immediately," Richard declared, his words ringing out like the strikes of an anvil. "He is to be escorted from the premises. The sole controlling owner of the holding company, the absolute majority shareholder of the buildings, the subsidiaries, and the international patents, is Arthur Sterling's biological daughter and sole heir. The new chief executive officer of Sterling Global Holdings is Maya Sterling." The lobby erupted. The press corps exploded into a chaotic symphony of shouted questions, camera flashes triggering so fast the room looked like it was caught in a lightning storm. Behind the velvet ropes, the corporate employees gasped, a wave of stunned, frantic whispers rippling through their ranks. I saw Maria, the night shift supervisor, gripping the rope with white knuckles, her eyes darting between Richard on the stage and me standing in the center of the floor, covered in Julian's scalding coffee. "Security!" Julian roared, spittle flying from his lips as he spun around, his immaculate midnight blue suit suddenly looking too large for his shrinking, panicked frame. "Security! Arrest that man! Arrest that filthy maid! She forged that document! It's a forgery! Get them out of my building! I am the CEO. I give the orders. 6 heavily armed building security guards, men who had patrolled this lobby for years, stepped forward from the perimeter. Julian's eyes lit up with a desperate, manic hope. But the guards did not move toward Richard. They did not move toward me. They stopped, looking directly at the lead FBI agent, who calmly pulled his badge from his windbreaker and held it up. The security guards nodded, immediately lowering their radios and stepping backward, crossing their arms over their chests and standing down. They were not Julian's private army anymore. They worked for me. Julian stared at the guards, the realization crashing into him like a physical blow. The absolute power he had wielded just 5 minutes ago, the power that had allowed him to treat thousands of people like disposable trash, had simply evaporated. He had no authority. He had no army. He was just a man shouting in a lobby. "Julian Vance!" a voice rang out sharp and metallic. The lead FBI agent stepped up to the edge of the stage, accompanied by Aris, the forensic accountant. The agent did not raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his federal authority commanded the room's instant silence. "We are not here to enforce a corporate eviction, Mr. Vance," the agent said, pulling a thick bound dossier from Aris's hands. "We are here to execute a federal arrest warrant." Julian physically staggered, stumbling backward until his hip hit the acrylic podium. "Arrest? For what? I haven't done anything. I am a legitimate businessman." Aris pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, stepping into the glare of the camera lights. He opened the heavy silver briefcase he was carrying, pulling out an enlarged, high-resolution photograph. It was the photograph I had taken in the dark silence of Julian's penthouse office. The photograph of the leather-bound ledger. "We have spent the last 14 days conducting a parallel forensic audit of your offshore routing accounts in the Cayman Islands," Aris stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a pure mathematical executioner. "We have decrypted the shell companies you established under the guise of this impending merger. We have irrefutable digital and physical proof that over the past 6 months, you have systematically embezzled $42 million directly from the Sterling Global Employee Pension Fund." A collective, horrified gasp tore through the section of corporate employees. The terror of unemployment was instantly replaced by the sickening realization that they had been robbed. I watched a senior data analyst physically brace himself against a marble pillar, his face turning an ashen gray. "You cannibalized the retirement savings of thousands of working-class people to fund your private real estate acquisitions and luxury lifestyle," the FBI agent continued, his voice ringing with disgust. "You are being charged with 34 counts of federal wire fraud, gross violations of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and corporate embezzlement. The Department of Justice has already frozen every single one of your offshore and domestic accounts." "No!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking, tearing at his hair in a display of absolute, unhinged desperation. "It's encrypted. The ledger is locked in the credenza. You couldn't possibly have the routing numbers. You couldn't—" He stopped dead. His wide, frantic eyes darted away from the FBI agent and locked onto me. He stared at the yellow plastic mop bucket. He stared at the heavy canvas supply belt around my waist. He remembered the night he had walked into his office to find me scrubbing the baseboards beneath the credenza. The horrific, crushing realization that the invisible, uneducated maid he had tormented for a month had been the architect of his total destruction hit him with the force of a freight train. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I held his gaze with cold, absolute dominance. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down to my waist. I unclasped the heavy metal buckle of the black canvas supply belt. The thick fabric fell away, hitting the marble floor with a heavy, clanking thud. The spray bottles of bleach and ammonia rattled against the stone. I reached up to the nape of my neck and untied the knot of the dark, stained apron. I pulled the heavy fabric over my head. Julian watched, paralyzed. as the physical symbols of my servitude were stripped away. I dropped the apron onto the pile of cleaning supplies. Underneath, my thin gray uniform shirt was plastered to my skin, stained dark brown with the scalding coffee he had thrown at me. But I didn't try to hide it. I wore the stain like a badge of honor. It was the physical proof of his cruelty, broadcasted live to the entire world. I rolled my shoulders back, lengthening my spine, standing tall in the center of the room. The terrified, subservient posture I had perfected over 15 years vanished completely, replaced by the poised, unshakable dignity of Arthur Sterling's daughter. "You thought you were untouchable because you believed people like me didn't matter," I said, my voice projecting clearly into the ambient microphones, echoing over the total silence of the crowd. "You thought poverty made us blind. You thought scrubbing your floors made us deaf. But we see everything, Julian. And today, you are going to pay for every single thing you stole." Two federal agents moved up the steps of the stage, grasping Julian's arms and forcibly pulling his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the concourse. Julian didn't fight back. He went entirely limp, his perfectly styled hair falling into his eyes, his designer suit wrinkling as he was marched down the stairs in front of the flashing cameras. He was a broken, humiliated shell of a man, stripped of his stolen crown. As the agents led him toward the revolving doors, the corporate employees, the people whose futures he had tried to destroy, began to applaud. It started as a hesitant, scattered clapping, but quickly swelled into a deafening, thunderous roar of vindication and relief that shook the massive crystal chandeliers hanging high above. Richard stepped down from the podium, walking over to me. He did not say a word. He simply offered a deep, respectful nod, acknowledging the transition of power. The empire was secure. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. I turned slowly, letting my eyes sweep across the massive, cheering crowd. The flashing lights of the press corps bathed the marble lobby in a surreal, blinding glow. I looked past the velvet ropes, past the celebrating employees, past the federal agents securing the perimeter. And then, my breath caught in my throat. Standing near the very back of the lobby, crushed against a heavy marble pillar near the revolving doors, was a man. His clothes were soaked through from the freezing winter rain outside, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was shivering violently, clutching a damp, crumpled manila folder to his chest. A resume. He had clearly bypassed security during the chaos of the press conference, sneaking into the building in a desperate attempt to beg for an entry-level position at the very firm he believed could save him from the financial ruin he had brought upon himself. It was Marcus. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely devoid of comprehension. He was staring directly at me. He was watching the woman he had abused, gaslit, and discarded, the woman he had locked out in the cold, standing in the center of a billionaire's empire, bathed in the flashing lights of the national press, receiving the thunderous applause of an entire corporation. I held his gaze across the massive expanse of the marble floor. I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I watched the exact moment his fragile, arrogant mind finally shattered under the weight of his colossal, irreversible mistake. The federal agents moved with aggressive, synchronized precision, marching Julian Vance toward the massive revolving glass doors at the front of the lobby. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of the steel handcuffs had echoed like a final gavel strike, permanently severing his reign of terror. Julian stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping momentarily on the polished Italian marble. The immaculate midnight blue suit rumpled awkwardly around his slumped, defeated shoulders. He kept his chin tucked firmly to his chest, attempting to hide his face from the blinding, relentless strobe of the press cameras. He was completely stripped of his arrogant, predatory sneer, reduced to a hollow, humiliated shell. As he was pushed through the glass doors and out into the freezing, rain-swept plaza, the stunned silence in the lobby finally broke. It started as a single, echoing clap from a security guard standing near the velvet ropes. Then, another joined in. Within seconds, the entire concourse erupted. The corporate employees, the data analysts, the mailroom clerks, the maintenance staff, the night shift supervisors, unleashed a deafening, thunderous roar of applause. The sound vibrated off the vaulted ceilings and rattled the massive crystal chandeliers. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated relief and profound vindication. They were clapping for their survival. They were clapping for the end of a tyrant. I stood in the center of the marble floor, the scalding coffee still soaking through my thin gray uniform shirt, the dark stains spreading across my chest. But I did not feel the heat. I did not feel the dampness. I felt entirely, magnificently untethered. Through the sea of cheering employees and the chaotic swarm of financial reporters, a figure violently shoved his way forward. "Maya, Maya, honey." My gaze snapped toward the sound. Marcus was violently elbowing his way past a stunned cameraman, ducking under the burgundy velvet rope to breach the secure presentation area. He was a pathetic, shivering mess. His designer clothes were completely saturated from the freezing winter rain outside, clinging wetly to his frame. His hair was plastered to his forehead in messy, dark streaks. As he lunged toward me, he dropped the damp, crumpled manila folder he had been clutching to his chest, the pathetic resume he had brought to beg for a job. He let it fall to the marble floor, allowing it to be trampled beneath his wet shoes. His bloodshot, frantic eyes were wide, scanning the room, absorbing the reality of the situation. He saw the federal agents. He saw Richard Gable standing tall at the podium. He saw the massive golden Sterling Global logo illuminated on the digital screens. And he saw me, standing in the center of it all, holding the notarized property deed to a multi-billion-dollar empire. In a fraction of a second, I watched his brain short-circuit and completely rewire itself. The sheer, intoxicating gravity of the wealth and power surrounding me instantly overrode his humiliation. He forgot that he had locked me out of our home. He forgot that he had stolen my life savings to fund a con artist. He forgot that he had literally just been kneeling in the rain outside my apartment gate, screaming that I was nothing without him. His greed was a reflex, as automatic as breathing. "Darling, I'm here!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with a manufactured, desperate joy as he closed the distance between us. He threw his arms open wide, projecting his voice so the nearby press corps could hear him. "I knew it! I knew you could do it, honey! We did it! We're going to be okay!" He reached out, fully intending to pull me into a passionate, triumphant embrace for the cameras, ready to instantly claim his position as the supportive, loyal husband of a newly minted billionaire. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply leveled a look of such absolute glacial disgust at him that he froze mid-step, his arms dropping awkwardly to his sides. The manufactured smile on his wet face twitched and faltered. "Maya?" he whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the flashing cameras. "Honey, please. Let's just go upstairs to our new office. We can celebrate. We have so much to celebrate." "You do not have an office here, Marcus." My voice was quiet, but it carried a razor-sharp, lethal edge that made him physically recoil. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his eyes widening in panic. "I'm your husband. What's yours is mine. We're a team, Maya. I'm here to support you in running this place." Before I could utter another word, a tall, imposing figure stepped smoothly between us. Richard Gable materialized with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator. He did not look at Marcus with anger. He looked at him with the cold, detached, clinical interest one might reserve for a squashed insect on the sidewalk. "Mr. Vance," Richard said, his deep baritone voice rumbling with absolute legal authority, "you are trespassing on private corporate property." Marcus scoffed, puffing out his wet chest in a pathetic attempt to assert dominance. I'm not trespassing. I'm the CEO's husband. Step aside, lawyer. Richard did not step aside. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate suit jacket and produced a crisp, perfectly dry manila envelope. He held it out, pressing the edge of the stiff paper directly against Marcus's soaked chest. "Marcus Vance," Richard announced, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the lobby. "You are hereby served." Marcus blinked, looking down at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. His hands trembled as he slowly took it, his wet fingers fumbling with the metal clasp. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, the bold black header type glaring up at him. Final decree of dissolution of marriage. "What is this?" Marcus gasped, his breathing turning ragged and shallow. "You can't do this. You can't divorce me. We have assets to divide. I am legally entitled to half of this holding company." "You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing," Richard countered, his voice cutting through Marcus's hysteria like a scalpel. The 30-day probate period explicitly and legally shielded the entirety of the Sterling estate within an impenetrable, blind trust until the transfer to Maya was absolute. You were never named as a beneficiary. You never had access to the trust. Furthermore, Maya filed for an expedited, fault-based dissolution of marriage the very morning you locked her out of your residence. Marcus's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. Fault-based? What fault? "Financial fraud, grand larceny, and gross marital misconduct," Richard listed smoothly, checking off the items on his fingers. "We have the bank records proving you illegally drained a joint savings account. We have the wire transfers proving you funneled those stolen funds into a fraudulent offshore LLC. Because you committed documented financial crimes against your spouse, the presiding judge has granted an emergency, absolute separation of assets." Richard leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear the final crushing blow. "Maya retains total unencumbered ownership of Sterling Global Holdings," Richard whispered. "You retain total unencumbered ownership of your maxed-out credit cards, your fraudulent investments, and your absolute ruin. You get exactly what you earned, Marcus. Nothing." Marcus stared at the documents, his lips trembling, his eyes welling with fresh, pathetic tears. The desperate, greedy fantasy he had constructed in his mind over the last 3 minutes violently imploded. He looked up at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, naked terror. "Maya, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "Chloe took everything. I have $50 in my checking account. I can't pay for a hotel. I don't have a car. Please, you can't just leave me with nothing." I looked at the man who had systematically belittled me, mocked my background, and replaced me with a grifter because he wanted a younger, shinier accessory for his fragile ego. I looked at the man who had happily watched me scrub floors until my hands bled so he could buy expensive suits. "You aren't my problem anymore, Marcus," I said softly. I offered a subtle nod to the building security guards standing nearby. 2 massive men in dark suits immediately stepped forward, flanking Marcus on either side. They grabbed him by his soaking wet arms, their grips firm and uncompromising. "No! Maya, wait!" Marcus screamed, thrashing wildly against the guard's hold, dropping the divorce papers onto the floor. "You owe me! I am your husband! You owe me!" His hysterical, high-pitched screams echoed through the lobby as the guards physically dragged him backward toward the revolving doors. The press corps eagerly snapped photos of the weeping, ruined man being violently ejected from the premises. He was pushed out into the freezing, relentless rain, completely alone. Richard bent down, calmly retrieved the discarded divorce documents, and handed them to an assistant to be formally filed. He turned back to me, a rare, genuine smile softening the sharp angles of his face. "There is one final piece of housekeeping to attend to, Ms. Sterling," Richard said, his tone shifting from legal executioner to trusted advisor. My investigative team pulled the county property records this morning. The bank officially finalized the foreclosure on Evelyn Vance's suburban estate at 8 a.m. today. A profound, serene warmth bloomed in my chest. And where are they? The county sheriff arrived to oversee their eviction 2 hours ago, Richard replied, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. I am told Evelyn and Marcus are currently moving their remaining possessions, packed primarily in black plastic trash bags, into a very small, deeply run-down, one-bedroom apartment in the industrial sector. They are entirely bankrupt, socially exiled, and entirely broken. The justice is absolute, clean, and perfectly aligned with their own terrible choices. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the reality of it wash over me. The ghosts were gone. The parasites had been burned away. The slate was completely, flawlessly clean. Thank you, Richard, I said, my voice steady and resonant. My pleasure, Maya, he replied, gesturing toward the back of the lobby. Now I believe you have a company to run. I turned away from the cheering crowds, the flashing cameras, and the velvet ropes. I walked across the vast expanse of the Italian marble floor, moving with a quiet, undeniable purpose. The heavy black canvas supply belt and the stained apron lay forgotten in a heap near the podium. I approached the heavily guarded, polished brass doors of the executive elevator bank. The security guard stationed there did not ask for my ID. He did not ask what floor I was cleaning. He stood up perfectly straight, offered a deep, respectful bow, and pressed the call button for me. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. I stepped inside the spacious car, surrounded by rich mahogany paneling and mirrored walls. I reached out and pressed the button for the penthouse. The elevator surged upward, the quiet hum of the machinery vibrating through the soles of my shoes. The digital floor indicator ticked higher and higher, leaving the noise, the chaos, and the ghosts of the lobby far below me. 50, 60, 70. With a final smooth deceleration, the elevator came to a halt. The doors glided apart. I stepped out into the quiet, pristine silence of the penthouse executive suite. The air was cool and smelled of expensive leather and lemon oil. I walked slowly down the wide, carpeted corridor, my footsteps making no sound. I reached the heavy, double oak doors at the end of the hall. Julian's nameplate had already been unscrewed and removed, leaving a faint rectangular shadow on the polished wood. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the sprawling, magnificent office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city skyline, the storm clouds breaking apart to reveal the bright, piercing blue sky beyond. The city stretched out below me, vast and quiet. I walked across the plush carpet, moving past the leather sofas and the hidden credenza where I had captured the evidence of Julian's ruin. I approached the massive, hand-carved mahogany desk situated directly in front of the skyline windows. I ran my calloused fingertips over the smooth, polished surface of the wood. The desk was completely clear. Julian's expensive pens, his crystal decanters, his arrogant clutter, it had all been swept away. I walked around to the back of the desk. I reached out and pulled back the heavy, high-backed leather executive chair. I sat down. The leather groaned softly as I settled into the seat. I placed my hands flat on the desk, looking out over the sprawling empire that my father had built. The empire I had bled for, fought for, and finally reclaimed. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, ringing with power and possibility. The waiting was over. The reign of Maya Sterling had officially begun. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, ringing with power and a vast, breathtaking possibility. I sat behind Arthur Sterling's massive, hand-carved mahogany desk, running my calloused fingertips over the cool, polished wood. For the first time in 15 years, My nervous system slowly began to uncoil. The perpetual buzzing adrenaline that had kept me alive, that had fueled my grueling night shifts and my meticulous high-stakes war against Julian and Marcus, finally began to recede. I was no longer hunted. I was no longer fighting for scraps. I was the apex predator, and the empire was entirely mine. But ruling an empire required a different kind of strength than conquering one. I spent my first 48 hours as the undisputed CEO of Sterling Global Holdings, locked in that penthouse, absorbing the sheer, staggering scale of the corporate infrastructure. I did not suffer from imposter syndrome. I knew exactly how brilliant I was, and I knew exactly how much I had sacrificed to reclaim my birthright. But I also possessed the cold, pragmatic self-awareness to recognize what I did not know. I did not have an Ivy League MBA. I did not have decades of traditional corporate finance experience. I didn't need to pretend I did. I simply needed to build a cabinet of absolute, unquestionable loyalty. My first executive action was officially appointing Richard Gable as the Chief Legal Officer and Executive Vice President of Sterling Global. His tactical brilliance and unyielding loyalty had been the shield that allowed me to survive the 30-day probate period. Eris, the forensic accountant who had surgically dismantled Julian's offshore embezzlement network, was immediately named Chief Financial Officer. I gave him a singular, unwavering directive: tear the company's ledgers down to the studs, root out any remaining corruption, and rebuild our financial architecture with total bulletproof transparency. But I needed someone else. I needed a second-in-command who understood the human element of survival, someone who possessed the same relentless, gritty resilience that I did. I picked up the heavy, multi-line executive phone on my desk, bypassed the corporate headhunters, and dialed a number I knew by heart. 2 days later, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse swung open, and Sarah stepped hesitantly onto the plush carpet. She looked exactly the same as she had during the darkest, most agonizing days of my marriage to Marcus. She was the friend who had quietly slipped me extra cash when Marcus drained our accounts, the woman who had fiercely defended my sanity when he was actively gaslighting me, and the only person who had consistently reminded me of my own worth when I was too exhausted to see it myself. She stared at me, sitting behind the billionaire's desk, her jaw slightly slack. "Maya?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide, taking in the panoramic view and the immaculate high-end tailored suit I was now wearing. "When you said you had a new job and needed some operational help, I thought you meant managing a boutique or a storefront. What is this?" I stood up, walking around the massive desk, and pulled my oldest, truest friend into a fierce, bone-crushing embrace. "This is my father's company," I said, pulling back to look her directly in the eyes. "And I need someone I can trust implicitly to help me run it. I need someone who knows how to manage chaos, who doesn't flinch under pressure, and who knows how to spot a liar from a mile away. I am naming you the Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Global Holdings." Sarah blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek as a breathless, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "Maya, I don't have the resume for a multi-billion-dollar holding company. You have a spine of steel and a flawless moral compass," I countered firmly, gesturing to the sprawling city below. "I can hire 100 analysts to crunch numbers. I cannot buy loyalty, and I cannot buy your kind of operational instincts. You are getting a massive promotion, a corner office, and a compensation package that will ensure you never have to worry about a grocery bill for the rest of your natural life." With my executive foundation set, I pivoted my absolute, undivided focus to the heart of the company. Julian Vance had ruled Sterling Global through a regime of elitist terror. He had viewed the human beings who kept the building functioning, the administrative assistants, the mailroom clerks, the security guards, and the janitorial staff, as invisible, disposable machinery. He had literally stolen their futures to line his own pockets. I intended to shatter that toxic culture with the force of a sledgehammer. On my 5th day as CEO, I summoned the entire remaining executive board to the primary glass-walled conference room. These were the men and women who had stood by silently while Julian looted the pension fund. They sat rigidly in their ergonomic chairs, sweating through their expensive suits, terrified that the axe was about to swing in their direction. I did not sit down. I paced the length of the long glass table, my posture radiating the uncompromising authority I had forged in the dark. The era of corporate cannibalism within these walls is permanently over, I announced, my voice quiet, cutting, and absolute. Aris is currently restoring every single stolen dollar to the employee pension fund with an additional 10% compensatory match directly from my personal equity. But we are not stopping there. I slid a thick, freshly printed policy mandate down the center of the glass table. Effective at midnight tonight, the entire support infrastructure of Sterling Global is undergoing a sweeping, non-negotiable reform, I stated, locking eyes with a pale, trembling vice president of human resources. The base wage for all janitorial, maintenance, and security staff is being raised by 40%. They are to receive comprehensive, top-tier health benefits, full 401k matching, and guaranteed paid family leave. Furthermore, I am implementing a zero-tolerance, strike-one anti-harassment policy. If any executive, director, or manager speaks down to, belittles, or degrades a member of the support staff, you will not receive a warning. You will be immediately and publicly terminated. The executive stared at the mandate in stunned, breathless silence. This building functions because of the people who clean our floors, secure our doors, and maintain our servers, I concluded, my tone brokering absolutely no debate. You will treat them with the profound respect they deserve, or you will find employment elsewhere. Are we entirely clear? A chorus of rapid, terrified, and highly compliant agreements echoed around the room. That evening, I did not take the private executive elevator down to the lobby. I took the service elevator to the sub-basement. I walked down the dim, concrete corridor toward the industrial locker rooms. Maria was standing by the heavy metal sinks, wringing out a microfiber cloth. The deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes looked heavier than usual. She had survived Julian's reign, but the fear of the unknown new CEO clearly weighed heavily on her shoulders. She turned as I entered, her eyes widening in sheer shock as she recognized my face. She dropped the wet cloth into the sink, her hands flying to her mouth. She had seen the news. She knew who I was now. "Maya," she gasped, taking a hesitant step backward, suddenly terrified of the woman she had shared countless midnight coffee breaks with. "Ms. Sterling, I didn't know." I closed the distance between us, wrapping my arms around the older woman, holding her tightly. She smelled of bleach and lavender soap, a scent that instantly grounded me. "It's just Maya. Maria," I whispered, pulling away to hand her a crisp, sealed envelope. "I want you to open this." Maria's hands shook as she broke the seal. She pulled out the document inside. It was a new, permanent employment contract. It elevated her to the position of Director of Facilities Management. The salary printed on the second page was a number that would not only pay for her husband's medical care entirely, but would allow her to finally buy the small house she had dreamed of for 20 years. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, silently tracking down her weathered cheeks. She looked up at me, unable to form the words. "You aren't invisible anymore, Maria," I said softly, squeezing her shoulder. "None of us are." Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere inside the skyscraper underwent a profound, undeniable metamorphosis. The heavy, suffocating blanket of fear that Julian had draped over the concourse simply evaporated. People walked taller. Administrative assistants spoke up in meetings. The security guards smiled genuinely, as I walked through the lobby. The building transformed from a cold corporate machine into a place of mutual respect and shared dignity. 1 month into my tenure, I found myself standing alone in the penthouse office long after the rest of the executive floor had gone home. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city below transition from the deep, velvety purple of pre-dawn into the bright, fiery orange of a new morning. The sprawling Atlanta skyline glittered beneath me, a vast network of lights and steel waking up to a new day. I rested my forehead against the cool glass, reflecting on the long, brutal journey that had brought me to this exact coordinate in time. I thought about Marcus, rotting away in a cramped, moldy apartment, drowning under the crushing weight of the debt he had stolen from me. I thought about Evelyn, stripped of her suburban palace, forced to face the stark, humiliating reality of her own shallow existence. I thought about Julian Vance, sitting in a federal holding cell, his immaculate suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit, facing decades behind bars. They had tried to destroy me. They had subjected me to a crucible of psychological torment, financial ruin, and profound degradation. They had wanted to break my spirit, to mold me into a submissive, compliant victim who would quietly accept their cruelty. But looking out over the waking city, I realized their greatest mistake. The fire they had forced me to walk through had not burned me to ash. It had forged me into steel. The endless, bone-aching night shifts, the chemical burns, the silent endurance, it had all served a purpose. It had stripped away my naivety, my weakness, and my desperate need for external validation. It had taught me the fundamental mechanics of leverage, patience, and absolute clinical strategy. But most importantly, I realized that my true power did not come from the billions of dollars now resting in my bank accounts. It did not come from the mahogany desk or the title on the door. My power came from the fact that I had survived their horrific abuse without letting it turn me into a monster. I had taken the empire, but I had kept my humanity. I had used the heat of their fire to warm the people who actually mattered instead of burning them. I turned away from the glass, walking over to the small, elegant espresso machine resting on the side credenza. I brewed a single, strong cup of dark roast coffee. The rich, earthy aroma filled the quiet penthouse. I walked back to the window, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic mug. The first brilliant rays of the sun crested the horizon, washing the Atlanta skyline in a spectacular, blinding gold. The light flooded into the office, illuminating the mahogany desk and the crisp, clean paperwork waiting for my signature. I took a slow, deep sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. A profound, unshakable peace settled over my soul. They thought I was invisible because I cleaned their messes. They didn't realize that gave me the power to sweep them away.